10 years and she still thinks I love her. Alexander Whitmore said it into a phone at 11 at night, laughing standing in his own study while his wife slept upstairs. Mother, relax. She'll board that plane Friday thinking I bought her a gift. By the time she lands, the papers are filed, and she's 6,000 miles from anyone who'd take her side. Then he hung up, walked into their bedroom, kissed Claire's forehead, and told her she looked tired. What Alexander didn't know was that his wife was already awake, that she had been awake for a year, and that she had exactly 6 hours alone in that mansion before her flight. She didn't need 5. If this story moves you, please subscribe to the channel and stay with Claire until the very last minute. And leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. Claire Bennett had learned to hear a car engine from 3 rooms away. That was the thing nobody told her about being married to a powerful man. You don't lose your mind all at once. You lose it in small pieces, in habits you never chose, in the way your whole body learns to listen for the sound of a man deciding whether to come home. It was 9:40 at night, and dinner had been ready since 7. She had made the roast chicken. The one with the lemon and the rosemary from the pot on the kitchen windowsill. The one he used to call the only thing in the mansion worth more than the artwork. She had set the table. Not the long dining table that seated 20, the one his mother insisted on for holidays, but the small round one in the breakfast room because 10 years ago, Alexander told her that was where he felt most like a person and least like a Whitmore. She had lit the candles at 7. She had blown them out at 8. She had lit them again at 8:30, and then she sat down and looked at them and did not light them a third time. Rosa came in quietly and stopped in the doorway. "Mrs. Whitmore, should I put the food away?" "No," Claire said. "Give him a little longer." "Ma'am, it's cold." "Then warm it up when he comes." Rosa didn't move. "Rosa, please." The housekeeper looked at the table with the 2 plates and the candles that had burned down crooked, and something crossed her face that Claire had been pretending not to see for almost a year now. Pity. That was the thing. Not judgment. Pity. The kind of look you give a woman standing in the rain who insists she doesn't need an umbrella. "Yes, ma'am," Rosa said and left. The car came at 10:10. Claire heard the gate. She heard the tires on the stone. She heard the engine cut, and then a long pause, 40 seconds, maybe where nothing happened, and she knew exactly what that pause was because she had timed it before. That was the pause where he sat in the driver's seat and checked his phone one last time. That was the pause where he deleted something. The door opened, his shoes on the marble. "Claire, in here." He came in with his jacket over his arm and his tie already loose, and he was smiling, and God help her. The smile still worked on some animal part of her brain that had never learned better. "You waited," he said. "I made dinner." "Sweetheart, you shouldn't have waited." He leaned down and kissed the top of her head. He smelled like a bar, and under that, like something floral that was not hers. "Hartley kept us in that conference room until 9. 9. The man doesn't have a family he doesn't understand that other people do." Hartley. Hartley. The Baltimore thing. He dropped into the chair across from her and rubbed his face with both hands, and he did it so convincingly that for a moment she almost apologized for the question she hadn't asked yet. "Alexander." "Bill Hartley's wife called me at 6. Claire kept her voice completely flat. She had practiced flat. Flat was armor. She wanted to know if we were coming to the thing in Newport. She said Bill's been in Aspen since Sunday. The silence lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds is nothing. 3 seconds is a breath. But she watched him move through it, watched his eyes do a thing she had come to know intimately, a small flick to the left, a recalibration like a man changing lanes at 80 miles an hour without touching the brake. "Not Bill," he said easily. "Bill's son, Tom Hartley, runs the acquisitions desk now. Honey, you've met him. He was at the Christmas party. Tall kid, terrible haircut." And here was the part Claire hated most. Not the lie. The way he waited afterward, patient and kind, giving her all the room in the world to be the crazy one. "Right," she said. "Are we okay?" "We're fine." "Because you've got that look." "What look?" "The look where you've already had an entire argument with me in your head, and I lost." He grinned. He reached across and took her hand and squeezed it. "Claire, baby, you're overthinking. You do this. You get quiet in this house all day and you build things up." I know. Do you? Because I hate it when you get like this. I said I know. He kissed her knuckles. He ate the cold chicken and said it was the best thing he'd tasted all week. And he told a funny story about a lawyer from Delaware, and he laughed and she laughed too because she was very, very good at laughing. And upstairs, 20 minutes later when he was in the shower, his phone lit up on the nightstand, face down. It was always face down now. Claire did not pick it up. She wanted to. She wanted it so badly that her hand actually moved an inch across the sheets. But she didn't, and years later she would understand why. It wasn't loyalty, it wasn't trust, it was fear. Because a woman who picks up the phone has to live with what's inside it, and Claire Bennett was not ready yet to stop being the perfect wife. The phone went dark, then it lit up again, and then it lit up a third time, and the shower kept running, and Claire lay in the dark with her eyes open and listened to her own heart, and thought very clearly in a voice that sounded almost bored. He isn't even trying anymore. The envelope came on a Tuesday. Rosa brought it in with the mail at 9 in the morning, and it sat on top of a stack of catalogs and a charity invitation, plain and white, with Claire's name on it in block letters and no return address and no stamp. No stamp! That was the part that stopped her. No stamp meant it hadn't come through the post office. No stamp meant someone had walked up the driveway past the gate that required a code past the camera at the turn and put it in the box with their own hands. "Rosa," Claire said. "Was anyone here this morning?" "No, ma'am. Only the gardeners, Thursday people." "It's Tuesday." Rosa's face went still. "Yes, ma'am. It's Tuesday." Claire took the envelope into the library and closed the door, and she stood there holding it for a full minute before she opened it because some part of her already knew. That's the thing nobody believes afterward. Everybody thinks the wife is blind. The wife is never blind. The wife has been standing at the edge of the water for a year, watching the shape under the surface, telling herself it's a shadow. Inside was one photograph. It was taken at night through glass in a restaurant she didn't recognize. Alexander was on the left side of the frame with his back half turned, and his hand was on a woman's jaw, the whole hand fingers along her throat, the way he used to hold Claire's face when they were 26 and stupid and broke and happy. And he was kissing her. Claire looked at it for a long time. She did not scream. She did not cry. She noticed in a strange, detached way that her hands were completely steady, and she thought that's odd, and then she thought, oh, that's because I already knew. Then she looked closer. The woman's coat was on the back of the chair. It was cream-colored with a gold clasp at the collar, shaped like a small leaf. Claire had seen that coat. Not on television, not in a store. In her own front hall, 3 weeks ago, hanging on the hook by the door during Margaret's birthday lunch, and when Claire had asked whose it was, her mother-in-law had said, without even turning around, "One of the girls from Alexander's office, don't fuss, Claire." She put the photograph back in the envelope. She walked upstairs. She put it in the false bottom of her grandmother's sewing box, the one nobody in that house had ever opened, because nobody in that house had ever cared what was inside anything that belonged to her. And then she went downstairs and ordered flowers for the hospital gala. That night at dinner, she said, "Do you know a woman with a cream coat, gold leaf on the collar?" Alexander didn't look up from his plate. "That's very specific. It was at your mother's lunch. Half the North Shore was at my mother's lunch." He reached for the salt. "Why, I liked it. I wanted to ask where she got it." And now he looked up and he smiled warm and open and completely relaxed. And he said, "Sweetheart, if you want a coat, buy the coat. You don't need permission. You never needed permission." "I know. Then why do you always ask like you do?" And that right there was the exact moment Claire Bennett stopped being a wife and became something else. Because a guilty man flinches. A guilty man over-explains. A guilty man says, "What woman? I don't know any woman." Alexander didn't do any of those things. Alexander was so far past guilt that the question didn't even register as a threat. He had been lying to her so long so easily that lying had stopped costing him anything at all. The second envelope came 9 days later, 4 photographs this time. A hotel entrance on Arlington Street, Alexander holding the door. The same woman on his arm, laughing, her hand flat on his chest. A shot from a parking garage, his car, her leaning in the passenger window, and one taken in daylight on a sidewalk where he was pushing her hair behind her ear with his thumb. Claire spread all four on the library floor and knelt over them like a woman doing a puzzle. She noticed dates in the corners, small, digital, precise. The garage photo was from November. 14 months ago. Claire sat back on her heels in her own library, in her own house, in the dress she'd worn to her own anniversary dinner, and did the math that every betrayed woman eventually does, the terrible arithmetic where you take the date and drag it backward through your life and find out which memories were already dead when you were still living inside them. November. He'd given her a bracelet in November. He'd cried in November. He had actually cried sitting on the edge of the bathtub, telling her he was sorry he'd been distant, that the company was crushing him, that she was the only thing holding him together. He had cried. Claire got up. She walked to the powder room. She was extremely calm. She turned on the faucet and she braced both hands on the counter and she looked at herself in the mirror. And then she threw up. She was still on the floor 10 minutes later when she heard Margaret Whitmore's voice in the front hall. Claire, Claire, darling, the door was unlocked honestly. I've told Alexander 1,000 times. Margaret was 68 years old and had never once in her life waited to be invited into a room. She came into the library, saw the photographs on the floor, and stopped. Claire stood in the doorway of the powder room with water on her chin. Nobody spoke. And Claire watched her mother-in-law look down at 4 photographs of her son kissing another woman in her daughter-in-law's house, and she watched Margaret's face do absolutely nothing. No shock, no hand to the mouth, no gasp. Margaret bent, picked one up, tilted it toward the window, and said, "Well, that's a terrible angle of him." "Margaret, where did you get these?" "Margaret, did you know?" "Where did you get these?" Claire sharper now. "Did someone bring them here to this house?" And there it was. "Not is my son cheating? Not are you all right? Who else has seen them?" Claire's whole body went cold in a way she would remember for the rest of her life, and she heard herself say very quietly, "You knew." Margaret set the photograph down on the desk. She smoothed her skirt. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was almost gentle. And that was the worst part. "Sit down, dear." "I don't want to sit down." "Then stand, but listen." Margaret folded her hands. "You've been in this family 10 years. You're a lovely girl. You've been an asset, truly. You handle the charities better than I ever did, and you've never embarrassed us, and there's real value in that." "An asset." "Don't be dramatic. It's exhausting." Margaret's eyes moved over her up and down the way you'd price a chair. "Claire, I'm going to say something, and you're going to hate me, and in 5 years you'll thank me. Alexander is 41. My husband is 73, and his heart is a paper bag. There is no one after Alexander. Do you understand what I'm telling you? There is no one after him." "You're talking about a child." "I'm talking about 140 years. Margaret's voice didn't rise once. "This family has existed since 1881. My father held it together through the Depression. I held it together through my husband's affairs. And yes, dear, there were affairs, and I stayed because that's what the job is. And now I'm looking at the end of the line, and I'm looking at you, and I am so terribly sorry, but a woman who cannot give this family a future is just very expensive decoration." Claire didn't move. 4 years of doctors," she said. 4 years. And you sat with me. You held my hand in the waiting room at Brigham." "I did." "You prayed with me." "I did that too." Margaret picked up her purse. "And I meant it at the time, but we're past prayer now. Get out of my house." Margaret paused at the door and looked back with something that was almost affection. "Sweetheart," she said, "it was never your house." "Here is what nobody understands about that night." Claire didn't confront him. She had every photograph. She had his mother's voice still hanging in the air. She could have walked into his study at midnight and set the whole thing on fire, and part of her wanted it so badly her teeth ached. She didn't. She made him a plate. She sat with him. She asked about Baltimore, and he lied, and she said, and passed him the bread, and she watched him. She watched him the way you watch a man through one-way glass. She watched him check his phone twice and turn it over both times. She watched him say the word "we" about the company and "you" about the house. She watched him laugh at his own story and glance up to make sure she was laughing too. And somewhere around 11 o'clock, sitting in a dining room worth more than most American towns, Claire Bennett understood the single most important thing she would ever understand. He was not in love with Sophia. He was in love with the version of himself that never had to be caught. That's what he was protecting, not the girl, not the affair, the story. Alexander Whitmore had never lost a story in his life. He got to be the hero of every room he walked into, and if the facts didn't cooperate, he simply told them again until they did. He'd done it to business partners. He'd done it to his father. He'd been doing it to Claire for 10 years, gently, lovingly correcting her memory like a man straightening a crooked picture frame. So if she screamed, he'd win. If she cried, he'd win. If she threw the photographs at his chest, he would hold her while she shook, and he would say, "Sweetheart, you're not well. You haven't been well since the last one." And by morning it would be her breakdown, not his betrayal, and by Christmas his mother would be telling people at the club that poor Claire had struggled, that the family had done everything. There was exactly one thing in the world Alexander Whitmore could not survive. He could not survive being seen. Not accused, not blamed, seen. The idea arrived quietly the way real ones do. It didn't feel like revenge, it felt like restoration. It felt like the work she'd trained for at 23 before she gave it up, standing in a basement in Florence with a scalpel the width of an eyelash, lifting 200 years of yellow varnish off a face nobody had seen since 1790. You don't paint over the damage, you remove what's hiding it. "Claire," Alexander said, "where'd you go?" She smiled at him. It was the first honest smile she'd given him in a year. "Nowhere," she said. "I'm right here." 3 days later, he brought her the brochure. He came home early, which he never did, with a bottle of the Sancerre she liked, and a folder under his arm, and he was practically vibrating. And Rosa, God bless her, caught Claire's eye across the kitchen and gave the smallest shake of her head. "Sit down," he said. "Sit, sit." He slid the folder across the counter. The Institut de Restauration, Paris. An 11-month fellowship residency, included starting the 4th of next month. Claire opened it very slowly. "How?" she said. "I called them. Alexander, this program takes 12 people a year, from the whole world. And I told them they were taking 13. He was beaming. He looked 26 again. "Baby, you gave this up for me. You gave up everything for me. Do you know what that's done to me? Watching you in this house for 10 years being brilliant at nothing. That's not." "It is. It is." And I let it happen. He took her hands. His eyes were actually wet. That was the thing about Alexander. The tears were always real. That was what made him so dangerous. "I've been a terrible husband, Claire. I know that. I've been distant, and I've been cold, and I've been buried in the company, and I'm not going to be that man anymore. So go. Go be who you were supposed to be." For a year. 11 months. And you'd be here. I'd be on a plane every 3 weeks. He kissed her hands, one and then the other. "Claire, this is us starting over. This is me choosing you. Say yes." And Claire Bennett looked into the face of the man she had loved for 18 years, since a coffee shop on Newbury Street when he was a kid with holes in his shoes, and a laugh that filled the room. And she understood that he had just handed her the shovel for her own grave and asked her to thank him for it. The 4th of next month. 6 weeks. Long enough to be gone. Long enough that when the announcement came, everyone at the club would nod and murmur and say, "Well, of course she left. She went to Europe. He was here alone for a year, the poor man, and these things happen. He wasn't setting her free. He was setting the stage." "Yes," Claire said. Alexander pulled her into his arms and held her so tight her ribs hurt, and over his shoulder with her chin on his collarbone and her eyes wide open. Claire watched Rosa turn around at the sink and quietly start to cry. "You won't regret it," he whispered into her hair. "No," Claire said. "I won't." The guest house was the last thing. Claire hadn't gone in there in 2 years. There was no reason to. It sat past the tennis court behind the hedge, and it had been closed since Alexander's cousin moved out. But the landscaper mentioned it offhand on a Thursday, said the crew had been asked to clear the path, said the electricians had been through, and would Mrs. Whitmore be wanting the old crib moved out of the small room or left in. Claire said, "The what?" She walked down there in her gardening clothes with dirt on her knees. The door was unlocked. The living room was full of paint cans and drop cloths. Someone had ripped out the old carpet. And the small room at the back, the one with the window facing the orchard, the room she had walked past 1,000 times and never once entered, because she couldn't, because for 4 years she couldn't look at any room that size without her chest caving in that room, was painted the softest yellow she had ever seen. There was a rug, there was a rocking chair, there was a paper bag from a store on Boylston Street with tissue paper folded over the top, and inside it, when she looked, was a blanket the color of cream, with a small leaf embroidered in gold thread in the corner. Claire stood in that room for 11 minutes. She did not cry. She took out her phone. She photographed the room. She photographed the receipt taped to the paint can dated 3 weeks before Alexander handed her the brochure and told her he was choosing her. She photographed the blanket. She photographed the gold leaf. Then she put everything back exactly as she'd found it, walked out, closed the door, and went up to the house and washed the dirt off her hands. That night she made the call. Hayes and Associates. I need to speak with Victoria Hayes. Ms. Hayes is with a client. Can I take a... Tell her it's Claire Whitmore. Claire looked out the window at the guest house roof over the hedge. Tell her it's about the Whitmores. She'll take the call. 11 seconds. Mrs. Whitmore, a woman's voice dry as a stone. I've been wondering when you'd get to me. Wondering. Your mother-in-law tried to hire me in April to represent your husband. A pause. I declined. I'd like you to understand that I declined before I knew your name, and I'd like you to understand why I'm telling you. Are you somewhere you can talk? Yes. Then listen carefully, because you have very little time and you're about to make a mistake. Are you planning to confront him? No. Are you planning to cry? No. Victoria Hayes let out a breath. Good, she said. Then we might actually win. The last piece came from the cameras. Claire finally asked. She asked the head of security, a quiet ex-cop named Fenwick, who had worked that gate for 6 years and had never once looked at her with pity, which was, she realized later, its own kind of message. Mr. Fenwick, someone's been leaving envelopes. He didn't ask what envelopes. He pulled the footage up on his laptop in the little room off the garage, and Claire stood behind his shoulder and watched a car come up to the gate at 6:50 in the morning on that first Tuesday and stop. A woman got out. She was young, dark coat. She walked to the mailbox, put the envelope in, and then she stopped. She turned. She stood at the end of the driveway and looked up at the house for a long moment at the windows at Claire's bedroom window, and even in bad gray footage from 90 feet away, Claire could see her face perfectly. She had seen that face 14 times in photographs. Sophia Carter had delivered them herself. Claire's hand closed on the back of Fenwick's chair. Play it again. He played it again. There it was. There it was, the woman standing in the dark at the end of the driveway looking up at the house of the wife she was replacing, and then getting back in her car and driving away. And Claire understood all at once the whole shape of it, and it was so much uglier than anything she had imagined. Nobody had been trying to warn her. Sophia hadn't sent those photographs out of guilt or conscience or some late-night crisis of the soul. Sophia had sent them because Alexander was taking too long, because Margaret was taking too long, because there was a yellow room behind the hedge with a rug in it and a blanket with a gold leaf, and there was a woman still living in the big house, and the timeline was slipping. Sophia Carter had photographed her own affair and mailed it to the wife to hurry her along. She hadn't been trying to open Claire's eyes. She'd been trying to open the door. Mrs. Whitmore, Fenwick said quietly. Are you all right? Claire straightened up. Mr. Fenwick, she said. How far back does this system keep footage? 18 months. Then it writes over. And the interior cameras? Same. He hesitated. Ma'am, the interior cameras cover the halls, the entry, the stairs, the study door, not the rooms. That's fine. Mr. Whitmore has never asked me for that footage, not once in 6 years. Fenwick looked straight ahead at the screen, and his jaw moved. Nobody's ever asked me for anything, ma'am, and I've been at that gate a long time. Mr. Fenwick. Ma'am, if I asked you to copy all of it, everything to a drive for me, would that be a problem for you? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My mother cleaned houses in Wellesley for 31 years. She used to say you can tell everything about a family by how they talk to the help when they think the help isn't listening. He reached over and pulled a drive out of his desk drawer, and he set it on the table between them. "I already made it, Mrs. Whitmore. 3 weeks ago. I was waiting for you to ask." She flew out on the 4th. Alexander drove her to Logan himself. He carried her bag. He kissed her at the curb in front of everyone and told her he was proud of her, and he meant it in the way he meant everything for as long as he was saying it. 11 months, he said. 11 months, she agreed. "I'll be there in 3 weeks, 3rd weekend. I'm already blocking it." "I know you will." He touched her cheek. "You're not scared." And Claire Bennett looked up at her husband and smiled, and it was so warm and so real that he smiled back without thinking. "No," she said. "I'm not scared at all." She waited until his car merged onto the ramp. Then she picked up her bag, walked back through the terminal doors, past the check-in counter, past the escalator out the far side to the taxi line, and got into a car. "Where to, ma'am?" She gave him the address of the mansion, because the house would be empty for 6 hours, because Alexander was going straight to the office and then to dinner with Sophia at 7, because Rosa had the day off and the guest house was finished, and there were 11 boxes waiting in a storage unit in Somerville under the name Claire Bennett No Whitmore anywhere on the paperwork, and inside those boxes were 416 photographs printed on archival paper, every one of them legally obtained, every one of them true. She had not made a single one of them cruel. She hadn't needed to. The driver caught her eye in the mirror. "Long flight." "I'm not flying today," Claire said. She looked out the window at the tunnel lights going by, and she thought about a scalpel the width of an eyelash, and about varnish, and about how the whole trick of restoration, the entire art of it, is that you never add anything. You only take away what's covering the face. "I'm just going home," she said, "to hang some pictures." 10:40 in the morning, and the gate was already open. Fenwick was standing beside it with his hands folded in front of him, the way he'd stood there for 6 years, and when the taxi turned in, he didn't wave and he didn't smile. He just stepped back and let it through, and Claire watched him in the rear window as the car went up the drive, and he was still standing there, still watching like a man holding a door for something that had been coming a long time. The taxi stopped at the top of the circle. "Ma'am?" the driver said. "You sure place looks closed up." "It's not closed," Claire said. "It's just quiet." She paid him. She got out with her carry-on bag, the one Alexander had lifted out of the trunk at Logan 40 minutes ago, the one he'd kissed her over, and she stood in front of the house she had lived in for 10 years and did not go inside. Not yet. At 10:44, a white box truck came up the drive behind her. The driver's name was Marcus. He was 26. He worked for a storage company in Somerville, and he had no idea what was in the 11 boxes he'd loaded that morning, because Claire had paid extra for him not to know. "Mrs. Bennett?" "Yes." "Where do you want them?" Claire turned around and looked up at the house. The windows, the columns his grandfather had shipped over from somewhere, the front door with the brass knocker Margaret had chosen. "All of it," she said. "Inside, front hall. 6 hours. That was of the whole window." Alexander was at the office until 4:30. Then he had the thing with the Providence people, and then at 7 he'd be at the restaurant on Arlington Street with Sophia, the one from the photograph, the one with the glass front where they'd been careless enough to be photographed a year ago. He'd be back by 9:30. 10 at the latest. Rosa was off. Margaret was in Newport. Fenwick had the gate. 6 hours to undo 10 years. It was not enough time. It was going to have to be. Marcus got the ramp down and started moving boxes, and Claire stood in the front hall of the Whitmore house, with her coat still on, and listened to the sound of cardboard hitting marble. And she thought about the first time Victoria Hayes had ever spoken to her. That had been 6 weeks ago, in an office on the 18th floor, with no photographs on the walls. "Sit," Victoria had said. "Don't take your coat off. This won't take long." That's not usually how. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've done this for 22 years. I know how it usually goes. A woman comes in here, she cries for 40 minutes. I hand her a box of tissues. She tells me she wants to destroy him. And then in 6 weeks, she calls me and says she's decided to work on the marriage, and I've wasted $2,000 of billable prep." Victoria had sat down across from her, not behind the desk, across. "So I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and if you lie to me on any of them, I'll refer you to someone else and we'll both save ourselves a year." "All right." "Do you want him back?" No. Do you want him punished? Claire had thought about that one honestly, which surprised her. I want him seen, she said. Victoria's pen stopped. Say that again. Everyone in that world thinks he's the best man they know. He's charming, he remembers your kids' names, he gives money to the right things, and he has spent 10 years telling me I imagine things until I stopped trusting my own memory. If I stand up in a courtroom and scream, he wins. If I cry at the club, he wins. He always wins because he gets to tell the story after. Claire had folded her hands. I don't want him punished. Punishment is loud. I want him seen. That's quieter and it lasts longer. Victoria Hayes had put her pen down and looked at her for a long moment. Third question, she'd said. Are you willing to be patient? Because the plan you're describing takes preparation. And preparation feels like doing nothing, and doing nothing while a man lies to your face every night at dinner is the hardest work there is. Most people can't. They break. They confront. And the second you confront him, everything I could have done for you evaporates because a warned man moves money. I've been patient for a year. You've been asleep for a year, Victoria said. That's different. I'm asking if you can stay awake and act asleep. Those are opposite skills. And Claire had said, Ms. Hayes, I spent 4 years lying on a table in a fertility clinic being told to relax. I can act asleep. Victoria hadn't smiled, but something in her face had changed. Good, she'd said, and picked up her phone. Daniel, come in. She's real. At 11:05, Claire opened the first box. The photographs were face down, wrapped in tissue and sleeves, because she was still a restorer, and there were things her hands simply would not do. 416 prints on archival paper. Matte, not gloss. Gloss reflects. She'd tested it in the storage unit with a flashlight and rejected the whole first batch and paid to have them redone, and Marcus had thought she was insane. She took the first one out. It was the smallest, 4 by 6, a young man with holes in his sneakers standing outside a coffee shop on Newbury Street in 2007, squinting, laughing, one arm around a girl in a green sweater. Claire looked at it for a long time. Then she walked to the entry hall to the wall directly across from the front door, the wall that was the first thing anyone saw when they stepped inside, and she hung it there, alone, in the center, with 4 feet of empty white plaster all around it. Because everyone thought this was going to be an attack, it wasn't. It was a story, and stories start at the beginning. Daniel Brooks had come into Victoria's office 6 weeks ago wearing a windbreaker and carrying a folder, and he'd looked more like a plumber than an investigator, which he later told Claire was the entire point. Mrs. Whitmore. Claire. Claire. He'd sat down and put the folder on the table and not opened it. Before I show you anything, are you going to be okay? Everyone keeps asking me that. Yeah, and everybody says yes, and then about half of them throw up in my car. He'd shrugged. I'm not being polite. I need to know if you're going to be able to hear numbers because what's in here isn't romance. People think an affair is a love story that went to the wrong house. It isn't. It's a budget. A budget. Everything leaves a trail. Love doesn't leave a trail. Money leaves a trail. He'd opened the folder then. So let's start with the trail. At 11:20, Claire hung the second photograph. Their wedding. Not the posed one Margaret had framed in silver and put on the piano. The other one, the one the photographer had taken by accident, where Alexander had his forehead against hers, and his eyes closed and his hands shaking so badly you could see it in the print. She hung it 18 inches from the first. Then the third, the apartment in Somerville with the radiator that banged. The fourth, him asleep on a couch with a law book on his chest. The fifth, the sixth, the seventh, the trip to Maine. The night his father had his first heart attack and Alexander had cried in a hospital parking lot with his head in her lap. By 11:50, the entry hall was alive. Anyone walking through that front door would see in sequence in one unbroken line down 40 feet of wall, 18 years of 2 people who had actually loved each other. That was the part that would break him. Because if you walk into a house full of your own crimes, you can get angry. Anger is easy. Anger is a room you know how to be in. But if you walk into a house that starts with a boy with holes in his shoes and then walks you slowly, gently, honestly toward what that boy became, there's nowhere to stand. 2 years, Daniel had said. Claire had been holding a cup of coffee. She'd set it down. The photographs I got start 14 months ago. The photographs you got start when she decided you should have them. Daniel had slid a sheet across the table. This is a card statement. Corporate card Whitmore Holdings issued to A. Whitmore, coded to business development. First charge that isn't business is 26 months ago. Hotel in Providence, one night, $340. Providence. Yeah. Claire had gone very still. He took me to Providence 26 months ago, she'd said, for our anniversary. He said the company put him up. He said the room was comped. Daniel and Victoria had exchanged a look. Claire, Victoria said carefully, was it a nice room? It was the nicest room I'd ever been in. Was there champagne when you arrived? Yes. Was it already open? The coffee cup had rattled on the saucer, and Claire had put both hands flat on the table to stop it. He was there the night before, she'd said. He was there the night before. Daniel agreed. With her. With her. And then he checked out and he drove back to Boston and he picked me up and he drove me back down and carried my bag into that room. Claire had heard her own voice from very far away. He held the door for me. He said, "Welcome to your anniversary." "Yeah," Daniel said quietly. He watched me be happy in that room. Nobody had said anything for about 15 seconds. Then Victoria Hayes had done something she almost never did in a first meeting. She'd reached across the table and put her hand over Claire's. "That one's going to sit with you," she'd said. "I want you to let it. Don't rush past it and don't make yourself tough about it because we're going to need it later. That's not the worst thing in the folder, but it might be the truest one." At 12:15, Claire stood in the entry hall with a photograph in her hand of a hotel room door in Providence and did not hang it. Not there. Not in the beginning. She carried it down the hall and set it face down on the stairs' third step and went back to work. Marcus came through with 2 more boxes. "Ma'am, there's a guy at the gate." Claire's stomach dropped through the floor. "Who?" "Older guy. Security dude. He says, 'Do you want lunch?'" Claire actually had to hold the wall for a second. "He what?" "He says he's ordering a sandwich, and do you want a sandwich?" At 12:40, Fenwick came up to the house with a paper bag and set it on the hall table without looking at the walls, which Claire understood later was the single most professional thing anyone had ever done for her. "Turkey," he said. "There's a pickle. I didn't know about the pickle." "Mr. Fenwick." "Ma'am?" "You could lose your job." "I've been thinking about that." He looked at the floor. Then he looked up, and he looked at the first photograph, the boy with the holes in his shoes, and something moved across his face. "Mrs. Whitmore, can I say something out of line? Please." "That kid there." He nodded at the picture. "I never met him. 6 years. I never met that kid one time. I met a man who came through my gate and said the word buddy at me for 6 years, and never once used my name." Fenwick straightened his jacket. "You eat that sandwich. You've got 5 hours and 20 minutes. He walked out. Claire stood in the hall holding a turkey sandwich, and for the first time in 6 weeks, her eyes stung. She ate it standing up. She did not have time to sit. "Now the apartment," Daniel had said. "I don't need to see the apartment." "You do." "Daniel." "Claire, you need to see the apartment because you keep saying the word affair, and I need you to stop." He'd pulled out a lease. "This is a 2-bedroom in the Seaport, $12,000 a month, signed 23 months ago. Tenant of record is Whitmore Holdings, subleased to S. Carter for $1 a year, which, by the way, is how you know a lawyer wrote it, and a lawyer is going to hate it. He's paying her rent." "The company's paying her rent. That's not the same thing, and that's the whole case." Daniel had leaned forward. "A man can spend his own money on a girlfriend. It's ugly it costs him in the divorce, but it's legal. A man who spends the shareholders' money on a girlfriend and codes it business development for 23 months has done something else entirely, and the something else has a different name, and the different name doesn't get settled at a country club." Claire had looked at the lease for a long time. $12,000 a month, she'd said. "Yeah." "He told me we couldn't do the studio." "What studio?" "I wanted to convert the pool house into a restoration studio, just a bench and a light table and a fume hood." Claire had heard herself laughing, and it wasn't a good laugh. It was going to be $80,000 all in. He sat at that table with a legal pad and did the math with me for an hour, and he said, "Sweetheart, the cash flow's tight this year. Let's do it next year." He wrote it on a legal pad, Daniel. He drew me a chart. Daniel Brooks had rubbed his face. 23 months, he'd said. $276,000 in rent. Don't. $276,000 for her, and he made you a chart about 80. I said don't. I'm not doing it to hurt you. Daniel's voice had been very quiet. I'm doing it because in 6 weeks, you're going to have a moment where you feel sorry for him. Everybody does. It comes out of nowhere, and it takes you at the knees. And when it comes, I want you to remember the chart. At 1:30, the dining room. Claire had known this room would be the hardest, and she'd been right. 22 feet of table, 16 chairs. The room where she had hosted 400 dinners, where she had learned the seating rules, where Margaret had once corrected her pronunciation of a wine in front of a senator, and then squeezed her arm afterward and said, "We're all learning, dear." She hung the receipts here. Not photographs, paper. Blown up to 16 by 20 printed, clean one per frame, hung in a long, unbroken row at eye level down both walls, so that anyone standing at that table would be inside a circle of numbers. The Providence Hotel. The Seaport lease. 23 months of rent at $12,000 printed 23 times, because Victoria had said 1 is a fact and 23 is a verdict. The bracelet from Cartier, November, 3 days after he cried on the edge of the bathtub, $16,000. And directly under it, on the same wall at the same height, framed identically a page from a legal pad in Alexander's handwriting, a chart with the words Pool House Studio at the top and a number circled at the bottom, 80,000. Next to it, one word in Alexander's handwriting. Next year. Claire had found that legal pad in his desk drawer. He had kept it. That was the thing about Alexander. He kept everything because in his mind, he'd never done anything wrong. So what was there to hide? She hung it, stepped back and looked at the wall. Then she went into the powder room and ran the water and gripped the counter and breathed for 90 seconds. And then she came back out and kept working because it was 1:38 and she had 5 hours and 22 minutes. "You need to understand something about your mother-in-law," Victoria had said 4 weeks ago. "I understand my mother-in-law." "You don't." Victoria had pulled a chair around. "Claire, I've been across the table from Margaret Whitmore 3 times. Once for her cousin, once for a foundation dispute, once when her husband got sloppy in 1998. She has never lost. Do you know why? Because she has money. Everybody in that room has money. She's never lost because she's never once in her life been in a hurry." Victoria had tapped the table. "That woman will wait years. She waited out her husband's mistress. She waited out a lawsuit. She'll sit in a chair with her hands folded while everyone else in the room burns their own house down, and then she'll walk out through the smoke. So how do you beat her? You don't beat her. You make her be in a hurry." Victoria had smiled, and it was not warm. "And here's the good news, Claire. She already is, because there's no one after Alexander. She told you that herself. She's 68, her husband's heart is a paper bag, and she's watching 140 years end in a nursery behind a hedge. For the first time in her life, Margaret Whitmore is on a clock." Claire had sat with that. "She said I was decoration." "Yeah, well," Victoria had closed her folder. "Decoration doesn't hire me." At 2:10, Marcus knocked on the frame of the dining room door and didn't come in. "Ma'am?" "Yes." "I gotta ask." He was holding a box. He was looking at the 23 rent statements on the wall, and he had gone slightly gray. "Is this legal? Like, am I helping with something?" Claire turned around. "Marcus, how old are you?" 26. "Your mother alive?" "Yeah." "Okay." Claire took off her gloves. "Everything on these walls came to me legally. Every photograph was taken from a public street or given to me by someone who had the right to give it. Every document is a document from my own household, my own marriage, or was produced to my attorney. My attorney has reviewed each one. Her name is Victoria Hayes. She's in the phone book, and if anyone ever asks you a single question about today, you tell them to call her, and you don't say another word. Does that answer it?" Marcus was quiet. "My dad did this to my mom," he said. "Not the money part, the other part." "I know. She never got a room like this." He set the box down. "Where do you want it?" "At 240 the library." This was where the messages went. Daniel had gotten them the boring way, which is the only way that survives a courtroom. Not hacking, not spyware. Sophia Carter had a work account. Sophia Carter had used a work account on a work laptop belonging to Whitmore Holdings to conduct 23 months of a relationship with the CEO of Whitmore Holdings. And when Victoria Hayes sent a preservation letter to the company's own general counsel about misappropriation of corporate assets, that general counsel, a man named Peter Sung, who had been at that company for 19 years and had a fiduciary duty and a mortgage and a conscience, had done exactly what the law required him to do. He'd preserved, and then he'd produced. Claire hung the first one at 2:44. Sophia to Alexander, 11 months ago. When are you actually telling her? Alexander to Sophia, same day. After Paris, it's cleaner if she's gone. Sophia, you said that in March. Alexander, in March, she was still trying. You don't tell a woman like Claire while she's still trying. You wait till she stops. Claire read that one 4 times. Then she framed it and hung it at eye level in the room where she had read 700 books during 600 nights alone. And she thought calmly, distantly, he knew. He knew exactly what he was doing to me. He didn't do it out of weakness. He scheduled it. Sophia, your mother says June. Alexander, my mother says a lot of things. Sophia, your mother is the only one in this family who's ever done anything. Alexander, careful. Sophia, I'm just saying she's the one who came to me. Claire's hands had stopped. She'd been holding that print for 6 weeks. She'd read it 40 times, and every single time, the floor moved. Say it again, she'd said to Daniel in the office 4 weeks ago. Margaret recruited her. Say it in a sentence I can hold. Daniel had put both hands flat on the table. Sophia Carter did not walk into that company and seduce your husband. Sophia Carter was a 29-year-old marketing manager at a firm in Chicago with no connection to Boston, and 11 months before she was hired, she sat down to lunch at the Four Seasons with Margaret Whitmore. He'd slid a photograph across, 2 women at a table. This is from the hotel's own security system subpoenaed. Margaret paid. 9 weeks later, a position that had never existed before was created at Whitmore Holdings. Ms. Carter was the only candidate interviewed. Claire had not been able to speak. There's more, Victoria had said quietly. More. Margaret has been making payments. Victoria opened the folder. Personal account, not corporate, quarterly, consistent. They start the month Sophia moved to Boston, and they've never stopped. The memo line every single time says the same thing. She'd turned the page around. Claire had leaned forward and read one word, legacy. And that was the moment. Not the photograph, not the guest house, not the yellow paint. That was the moment Claire Bennett had stopped being sad. She held my hand, Claire had said. I know. In the waiting room at Brigham, she held my hand and she said, we'll try again. We're Whitmores, we don't quit. Claire had looked up and her voice had not shaken once. How long before that lunch had she already decided I was finished? Victoria had checked the date. The lunch was in April, she'd said. Your 4th transfer failed in February. 6 weeks. Margaret Whitmore had waited 6 weeks after her daughter-in-law's last miscarriage and then gone shopping for a replacement. At 3:15, Claire hung the Four Seasons photograph in the room Margaret liked best, the sitting room, the one with the good light where Margaret had received her guests for 30 years, where the Whitmore women had sat every Christmas since 1962. She hung it low, chair height, so you'd have to sit down to see it, and once you saw it, you'd be sitting. Underneath it, she hung the payment schedule. Under that, one quarterly transfer blown up the memo line, legible from across the room. Legacy. And then she did the thing that Victoria Hayes had told her not to do. The one flourish, the one moment of art, and Claire did it anyway, because there is a limit to how much of a woman you can restore before something of the original comes through. She hung Margaret's own words. Not a photograph. A transcript from a deposition in 1998 from the affair Victoria had handled, where Margaret Whitmore had sat under oath and been asked how she'd survived her husband's infidelity, and had answered on the record in a public document that anyone with a courthouse card could pull, "A woman who stays is not a fool. She is the only adult in the room. My husband will die owning nothing that I did not permit him to own." Claire framed that and hung it beside the payments, because Margaret had known. Margaret had sat in that exact chair in that exact room, being exactly the woman Claire was becoming. And then 27 years later, she had looked at her son's wife and called her decoration. At 3:40, Claire's phone rang. It was Alexander. She stood in the sitting room with 400 photographs unhung around her feet and looked at his name on the screen and let it ring 3 times. Then she picked up and made her voice smile. "Hi. Hey, you land okay? How was it? Did you sleep? A little?" Claire looked at the payment schedule on the wall. "It was smooth." "Baby, I'm so proud of you. I'm sitting here in this meeting and I keep thinking about it. You're in Paris. You're actually in Paris." "I'm actually here." "How's the apartment? Is it the one with the courtyard?" And here was the thing Claire had not expected. She was good at it. "It's beautiful," she said. "The window's enormous. There's a woman downstairs with a dog who barks at everything." He laughed. That laugh, the one from the coffee shop. "Send me a picture." "When I unpack." "Claire." His voice changed, got softer. "Hey, are we okay?" "Why wouldn't we be okay?" "I don't know. This morning at the curb, you were weird. You were happy. And you've been not happy for like a year, and this morning you were happy, and it messed me up a little." Claire closed her eyes. "You noticed," she said. "Of course I noticed. I notice everything about you." And there it was. That was the sentence. 14 years of marriage, and that was the one that finally did it, because it was said with total sincerity by a man standing in an office he'd bought with a company he was looting 3 hours before a dinner with the woman his mother had purchased. "I notice everything about you." "Alexander," Claire said. "Yeah. Do you remember the pool house?" Silence. "The what?" "The studio. The pool house studio. 2 years ago. You made a chart." A pause. 4 seconds. She could hear him searching, and she could hear him not finding it because it had never been in there. It had never once occupied a single square inch of his mind after the moment he'd said next year, and watched her nod. "Sure," he said warmly. "Of course." "Okay. Why, no reason." Claire opened her eyes. "I have to go. I'm meeting the program director." Okay, go." "Hey, Claire." "Yes." "I love you. I know I've been terrible. I know I have. But I'm going to fix it. I swear to God, I'm going to be the man you married." Claire looked at the boy with the holes in his shoes, 40 feet down the hall, hanging alone on the wall by the door. "I know you are," she said and hung up. Then she put the phone on the table, and she stood there for a second, and then she picked up a frame and threw it into the fireplace so hard the glass exploded. The sound went up through the whole empty house. She stood there breathing. Then she got the broom, swept it up, took the print out of the wreckage, checked it for damage, put it in a new frame from the box of spares she'd bought because she'd known that she'd break at least one, and she hung it on the wall. 2 hours and 40 minutes left. "Now," Daniel had said 3 weeks ago, "the bad one. There's a worse one. There's always a worse one." He hadn't opened the folder this time. He'd put his hand on it. "Claire, before I show you this, I want to tell you something because I've been doing this 19 years, and I've never said it to a client. You're the calmest person I've ever worked for, and it's starting to worry me. You haven't cried once. Would it help? It'd help me." Claire had almost smiled. "Daniel, when I was 23, I spent 9 months removing varnish from a portrait of a woman who died in 1802. 9 months, 6 days a week. And the entire time her face was under there, and it was ruined, and everyone said, 'Leave it, it's gone.'" She'd folded her hands. "You can't cry with a scalpel in your hand. So you learn to put the crying in a box on a shelf, and you tell it I'll come back for you, and then you work. And then when it's done, you go get the box. And do you Come back for it." "I always came back for it." Daniel had looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd opened the folder. It was a real estate document, a trust instrument, 22 pages dense, and Claire had taken it and read it, and understood exactly none of it for the first 90 seconds. Then she'd found her own name. "Why is my name on this? Read the third recital." She'd read it. Then she'd read it again. "This is my father's land," she'd said. "Yeah. This is the Vermont property. This is my grandmother's. This came to me in 2011. It's 40 acres and a house that's falling down. It's worth nothing. I told Alexander to handle the paperwork because I couldn't." Claire had stopped. "You couldn't look at it," Daniel said gently, "because your father had just died." "Yes." "And he said he'd handle it." "Yes." "He handled it." Daniel had turned to page 11. "In 2011, that parcel was worth about $400,000. Your husband put it into a Whitmore family holding entity with you as a beneficiary, which is fine, that's normal, that's tax planning. Then in 2019, the entity was restructured, and in the restructuring, the beneficiary class was amended." Claire's hands had gone numb. "Amended to what?" "Amended to lineal descendants of Alexander Whitmore." The room had been very quiet. "I don't have any children," Claire had said. "No," Daniel said, "you don't. So my father's land, my grandmother's house, the 40 acres my great-grandfather cleared with a horse." Claire had heard her voice going flat and strange. "In 2019, my husband quietly rewrote it so that it passes to a child that doesn't exist." "Yes, to his child." "To his child," Daniel said. "By anyone." Nobody had spoken for a while. Then Victoria Hayes had said very softly, "Claire, look at the signature page." And Claire had looked, and there was her signature. Perfect, loops and all. The way she'd signed her name since she was 15 years old, dated the 11th of March, 2019. "I was in Florence," she'd whispered. "You were in Florence," Victoria said, "for 11 days. We have your boarding pass, your hotel, and a photograph of you in the Uffizi, time-stamped at 2 in the afternoon on the 11th, which is 9 in the morning here, which is 40 minutes before a notary in Back Bay swore that you appeared before her in person and signed this document." Claire had put the paper down very carefully as if it might go off. "That's a crime," she'd said. "That's several," Victoria said. At 5:10, Claire hung the trust document. She hung it in the study, Alexander's study, the room with the leather and the decanter and the photograph of his grandfather, the room where he'd stood at 11 at night telling his mother that 10 years later, Claire still thought he loved her. She hung page 11 at eye level behind his desk chair so that when he sat down, it would be over his shoulder in every reflection in that room. And beside it, the signature page. And beside that, her boarding pass. And beside that, a photograph of a woman in a green coat standing in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence at 2 in the afternoon on the 11th of March, 2019, smiling at a portrait 6,000 miles away while a man in Boston signed her name. Claire stepped back and looked at it. And that was when it finally came. Not for the affair, not for the yellow room, not for the $276,000 or the champagne in Providence or Margaret's hand in the waiting room at Brigham. For the loops. He had practiced. That was the thought that finally broke her open standing in his study at 5:12 in the afternoon, with 2 hours and 48 minutes to go. To get that signature right, to make it that good, he had sat somewhere alone with a pen and practiced writing his wife's name over and over until it looked like her. He had studied her. He had at some point put in the work. Claire Bennett went down onto the floor of her husband's study and cried the way she had not cried in 4 years, ugly and loud and with no one in the house to hear it, and it lasted 11 minutes, and then it stopped. She got up. She washed her face in his bathroom. She looked in his mirror and she said out loud in an empty house, "Okay," and she went back to work. At 6:20 she hung the last of it. The guest house photographs went in the room off the kitchen, the one everyone walked through. The yellow paint, the rug, the rocking chair, the paper bag from Boylston Street, the blanket with the gold leaf, and in the hallway outside the master bedroom, the very last thing. not evidence. A photograph of Claire taken by a nurse at Brigham and Women's 4 years ago, in a chair in a gown 20 minutes after the fourth one failed. She was not crying in it. She was looking at the window. Margaret had taken it actually on Claire's own phone and said one day, "You'll want to remember how strong you were," and then never mentioned it again. Claire hung it alone on that wall. 6 weeks later, Margaret Whitmore had eaten lunch at the Four Seasons. Nobody would have to be told that. It was 3 rooms away. Anyone who walked from the bedroom to the sitting room would carry it themselves. At 6:41, Claire wrote the note. She used the cardstock from the desk, the heavy cream kind with the Whitmore crest, because there was a joke in there and she was allowed one. She wrote it in one line with no shaking, and she propped it against the largest photograph in the house, the one in the entry hall, the one of a boy with holes in his shoes outside a coffee shop on Newbury Street in 2007. "You spent 10 years hiding the truth inside this house. I didn't put anything here. I only stopped covering it up." Then she picked up her bag. At 6:46, she walked out the front door, and Marcus was gone, and the truck was gone, and the house behind her was completely silent and completely full. Fenwick was at the gate. He opened it. He didn't say anything. She stopped beside him. "Mr. Fenwick, at 9 tonight, the interior cameras." "Ma'am, they run automatic. Nothing I can do about that." He looked straight ahead. "They record everything in that house for 18 months, and I'm not authorized to shut them off, and it'd take a written order from a Whitmore to delete a single second." "That would be terrible." "Wouldn't it?" Fenwick said. Claire got into the car. Her flight was at 9:40, the real one, the one Victoria had booked under Bennett out of Providence, not Logan, because Victoria Hayes thought about things like that. At the end of the drive, the car turned, and Claire looked back one time at the house on the hill with every light on and every wall full. Then she looked forward, and somewhere over the Atlantic, 4 hours later, while a woman slept, sitting up with her hand curled loosely in her lap, Alexander Whitmore's car came through a gate that a man named Fenwick opened without a word and pulled up to a house where every single light was burning, and Sophia Carter said, "Why is it lit up like that?" And Alexander said, "I don't know. Rosa, maybe." And he opened his own front door. 9:04 in the evening, and the first thing Alexander Whitmore saw when he opened his own front door was a photograph of himself at 22. He stopped in the doorway with his key still in his hand. It hung alone on the wall directly across from him, 4 feet of empty plaster on every side, a small print in a plain frame, and in it, a kid with a bad haircut and holes in his sneakers stood outside a coffee shop on Newbury Street, with his arm around a girl in a green sweater, laughing at something that had happened 18 years ago and was gone. Sophia was still on the step behind him. "Why is it so bright in here?" He didn't answer. He walked in. There was a card propped against the frame, cream stock, the heavy kind with the family crest at the top, and he picked it up, and his eyes moved across one line of his wife's handwriting. "You spent 10 years hiding the truth inside this house. I didn't put anything here. I only stopped covering it up." "Alex, be quiet a second. Don't tell me to be... Sophia." His voice came out strange, thin. "Be quiet." He turned his head to the left down the length of the entry hall, and the whole thing was full. 40 feet of wall. Photographs in a line evenly spaced at exactly eye level, marching away from him toward the stairs, and they were not what he expected. And that was the first wrong thing that was the thing that made his stomach drop before his brain had caught up at all. There was no hotel, there was no woman, there was no crime. There was a wedding. There was a hand shaking so badly you could see it in the print. There was a radiator in Somerville. There was a hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning where a 29-year-old man had put his head in his wife's lap and cried about his father's heart. And Claire had taken that photograph herself with a disposable camera from above because she'd wanted to remember that he'd let her hold him. Alexander walked down the hall, and he did not know he was walking. 9:07. Sophia came in behind him, her heels loud on the marble, and she got about 6 steps and then stopped and said, "What is this?" "It's us." "What?" "It's us." He touched the edge of a frame. "That's Maine. That's the summer the car died." "Alex, there is something wrong here. We should go." "That's my father's hospital." "Alexander." "She hung our life on the wall," he said. And there was something in his voice that hadn't been there in years, a kind of wonder, and Sophia Carter heard it and went very cold, because in that half second she understood something that would take Alexander another 2 hours to understand. He wasn't horrified. He was moved. He was standing in a house that was in the process of ending him, and the first thing he felt was nostalgia. "Where is she?" Sophia said. "Paris." "Then who did this?" Alexander didn't answer. He'd reached the stairs. There was a photograph face down on the 3rd step. He picked it up and turned it over, and it was a hotel room door in Providence, with a number on it, and the number was 411. And underneath the print in the white margin in Claire's hand was a date. 2 years ago, the night before their anniversary. Alexander Whitmore stood on his own staircase and felt the floor tilt. "Alex, what is that?" "Nothing." "What is it?" He put it in his jacket pocket. That was the moment if anyone had been watching when the man began to break. Not the wall of receipts, not the study, that. A door number in his wife's handwriting, and the automatic reflex of 41 years reaching out to hide it. 911. He went for his phone. "Claire," he said, walking dialing. "Claire, come on, pick up, pick up." It rang once and went to voicemail. He called again, straight to voicemail. He called a 3rd time and got the recording and hung up and stood in the middle of his front hall and laughed one short, ugly bark of a laugh and said, "She's asleep. It's 3 a.m. there. She's asleep." "Alex. She's fine. She's in Paris. I put her on the plane myself this morning. I carried her bag." He was talking very fast. "I kissed her at the curb, Soph. I watched her walk in." "Did you watch her get on the plane?" Silence. "Did you watch her get on the plane, Alexander?" "You don't watch people get on planes. You drop them at the curb. That's what a curb is." Sophia didn't say anything. And Alexander Whitmore, who had never lost a story in his life, opened the airline app on his phone with hands that had started to shake and typed in a confirmation number he'd known by heart for 6 weeks. 913. He read it 3 times. "What?" Sophia said. "It says not checked in." "What does that mean?" "It means she didn't board." He kept staring at it. "It says the ticket wasn't used." "So, where is she?" And Alexander said in a voice that had gone completely flat, "She's not in Paris." 9:15. The dining room was worse. He went in there because he was moving now, because a man who is losing control walks, and he stopped inside the door and saw 22 feet of table and 16 chairs, and on both walls at eye level in identical frames going all the way around the room paper. Not pictures. Paper. He got close enough to read one, and it was a credit card statement. He got close enough to read the next one, and it was a lease. He turned around slowly in the middle of his own dining room, and he counted without meaning to, the way you count stairs in the dark, and he counted 23 of the same document hung side by side in a row. 23 months, $12,000, $12,000, $12,000, and behind him, Sophia made a small sound. "That's my apartment," she said. "Yes." "Alex, that's my address on the wall." "Yes." "Why is my address on the wall?" He didn't answer because he'd stopped in front of the last frame on the north wall, and it wasn't a statement. It was a page from a legal pad. His handwriting. Pool House Studio at the top, and a column of numbers he'd written out at that table with a pen in his hand, while his wife sat next to him with her chin on her fist, and a number circled at the bottom. 80,000. And under it in his own hand, 2 words. Next year, Alexander stared at it and felt something happen in his chest that he had no name for. He didn't remember writing it. That was the thing. He genuinely, honestly did not remember 1 second of that hour. It had been erased so completely from his mind that seeing it now was like reading a letter from a dead man, and directly beside it on the wall in the same frame size at the same height hung a receipt from Cartier for $16,000 dated November. And he remembered November. He remembered every second of November, because November was the night he'd cried on the edge of the bathtub, and it had worked. "Oh, God," he said. "Alex." "Oh, God." "Alexander, talk to me." He put both hands on the back of a chair. "She knows," he said. "Obviously she knows that's my apartment on the wall." "No." He looked up, and his eyes were wide and glassy and wrong. "You don't understand. She knows about the chart." 9:22. He called his mother. Margaret Whitmore picked up on the second ring from Newport from a dinner with music behind her. "Darling, I can't talk. I'm about to be seated. Get in the car." "What?" "Get in the car and come here right now." "Alexander, what on earth?" "Claire didn't get on the plane." He was walking again. He couldn't stop walking. "Claire didn't get on the plane, and she's been in the house, and there's Mother, there's paper on the walls, she's got the lease, she's got the Seaport lease." The music behind his mother stopped. That was how Alexander knew in that instant exactly how bad it was, because Margaret Whitmore had walked out of a dining room in the middle of a sentence, and Margaret Whitmore had never in her life left a room she was not finished with. "Say the word lease again," she said. 23 of them. She hung 23 of them. Nothing. "Mother. Is Sophia with you?" "Yes." "Put her out of the house." Alexander stopped walking. "What?" "Put that girl out of the house right now. Get her in a car, get her off the property, and do not let her look at another wall." Margaret's voice had gone somewhere he'd never heard it go. Not panic. Something colder than panic. Something like a surgeon's voice. "Alexander, listen to me. Are you listening?" "Yes." "What time are the Ashfords arriving?" And Alexander Whitmore's whole body went cold. 9:24, because he had forgotten. He had in 11 minutes completely forgotten why the house had been lit up, why the caterer had been told 10, why he'd told Sophia to wear the green dress, why 14 people, including his father, his uncle, 2 board members, the company's general counsel, and Margaret's oldest friend from the Fairfield Foundation, had all been invited to a small, informal, very special gathering at 10 o'clock on the 4th of the month, the day his wife left the country. That was the entire design. That was the elegance of it. Claire flies out in the morning. The family gathers that night. Nobody has to be told anything difficult. It simply becomes true while everyone is holding a glass. He had scheduled the announcement of his mistress's pregnancy for the day he put his wife on a plane. "Cancel it," Margaret said. "Cancel all of it. Call every one of them personally, say I'm ill, say your father's ill, say anything. They're already coming. Then stand at the gate and turn them around. Mother, it's 9:24. Then run. 9:26. He ran. That was the thing nobody who knew Alexander Whitmore would ever have believed, and it was on 18 months of interior camera footage, and it would be watched eventually by more people than he could stand to think about the CEO of Whitmore Holdings, running down his own hallway in a $4,000 suit with his phone in his hand. And he made it as far as the sitting room door, and he stopped. Because Sophia was in there. She was sitting down. She was sitting in this good chair, Margaret's chair in the room with the good light where the Whitmore women had sat every Christmas since 1962, and she was sitting down because you had to sit down to see it, and she had sat down, and now she was seeing it. A photograph hung low chair height. 2 women at a table at the Four Seasons, Sophia's own face 4 years younger, and across from her, Margaret Whitmore with her hand out mid-sentence. "Soph." She didn't move. "Sophia, we have to go." "Whose lunch is this?" she said. "Sophia, this is the lunch where I got the job." Her voice was very small and very even. "This is 11 months before you hired me. She told me she'd read about my work. She said she was a fan. She said my son's company needs someone modern." "Get up." I told her I wasn't going to move to Boston for an interview. Sophia was still looking at the photograph. She said, "Don't come for an interview. Come for lunch." And she paid, and she walked me to my car, and she said, "Some families choose their people, Sophia." Alexander's phone was ringing in his hand. He didn't look at it. "And then I met you 9 weeks later at a conference," Sophia said. "And I thought, God, what are the odds?" Sophia. "What are the odds, Alexander?" And then she looked down, because underneath the photograph there was more. A payment schedule, quarterly personal account. 16 transfers in a row, 4 years of them starting the month she moved to Boston and never stopping. And Sophia Carter leaned forward in Margaret Whitmore's chair and read a memo line she had never once seen in her life. Legacy, 9/31. "That's not my money," she said. "Soph, I never got that money." "It's not. Who got that money, Alexander?" And Alexander Whitmore, standing in the doorway of his mother's sitting room with 14 people 40 minutes away and his wife's handwriting in his pocket, said the truest sentence he had said in 3 years. "I don't know." Sophia stood up. She stood up very slowly, and she looked at him, and something came apart behind her face. "You said she came around to it," she said. "You said your mother came around. You said she was difficult at first, and then she came around because she saw how happy I made you." Her voice was rising. "You said that. In the car. In April. You said Mom's finally on board. Sophia, we don't have time. She was never on board. She built it." Sophia's hands had started to shake. "She built it before I ever met you. She sat down at a table and she picked me like a... She stopped. She turned her head and looked at the wall again, and there was one more frame beside the payments, and it wasn't a photograph or a receipt. It was a page of court transcript from 1998, and it was Margaret under oath 27 years ago. "A woman who stays is not a fool. She is the only adult in the room. My husband will die owning nothing that I did not permit him to own." Sophia read it twice. "Oh," she said. "Sophia. She's not making me the new wife." Sophia turned around, and she was white. "She's making me the new decoration." 9:34, and the first car came through the gate. Fenwick opened it. He'd been told to. That was the thing Alexander would scream about for months afterward in depositions, in an arbitration, in a hallway at the courthouse, to a lawyer who kept telling him to lower his voice. The gate was open because the gate had been told to be open at 9:30 for a party that the man of the house had planned. Fenwick was following instructions, Alexander's instructions. 9:36, and Charles Whitmore came through his son's front door with a bottle of champagne under his arm and stopped dead on the mat. He was 73 years old. His heart was a paper bag. He had run this company for 31 years before he handed it over, and he had made his own mistakes, God knew. And he had spent the last decade being managed by his wife and adored by his son. He looked at the wall. He looked at a photograph of a kid with holes in his sneakers. Then he looked at the next one, and the next, and he walked 10 feet down that hall, with the champagne still under his arm, and he stopped in front of a hospital parking lot at 2 a.m. "Dad." Charles didn't turn around. "Dad, don't there's been a..." "Whose camera?" Charles said. Who took this one?" His father's voice was rough. "The parking lot, who took it?" "Claire." "Yes," Charles said. "Claire." And he set the champagne down on the floor of the hallway, very carefully, like a man putting down something he no longer had a use for. 9:38, and the Ashfords arrived. 9:39, and Alexander's Uncle Ray. 9:40, and 2 board members and Margaret's friend from the Fairfield Foundation and a woman from the hospital gala committee who had known Claire for 9 years and had called her twice a week since she'd gone quiet and had never gotten a call back and had assumed she'd been forgotten. 9:41, and Peter Sung. Peter Sung had been the general counsel of Whitmore Holdings for 19 years. He'd received a preservation letter 6 weeks ago from a lawyer named Victoria Hayes, and he had done what the law told him to do, and then he had produced what the law told him to produce, and he had not slept well since, and he had come tonight because he had been told there would be an announcement, and he wanted to see it with his own eyes. He walked in the door and looked at the wall and did not react at all. He simply took out his phone and stepped into the corner of the entry hall and made a call. Alexander saw him do it. That was the exact instant Alexander would say later, when he understood he was not going to survive. Not his father, not Sophia, not the 23 leases. A quiet man in a corner with a phone. 9:43. Alexander. That was Nancy Ashford, 66 in pearls, standing in the entry hall with her coat still on and her head tipped to one side. "Alexander, this is lovely." He couldn't speak. "Truly. Is it an anniversary thing? Did Claire do this?" She moved down the wall. "Oh, look at you, look at your hair. Oh, and the wedding one. I've never seen this one. Look at your hands, you were shaking. Nancy, where is Claire?" Nancy turned around. "Is she hiding Claire?" "Claire, honey, this is beautiful," and her voice echoed up into a house where nobody answered. 9:44, and 14 people were standing in the hall of a mansion holding coats, looking at a wall, and there was no hostess, and there was no announcement. and there was a young woman in a green dress standing by the sitting room door with her arms wrapped around herself. And then Ray Whitmore said from the dining room doorway, in the voice of a man reading a road sign, "Alex, why is there a lease on the wall in here, 945? They moved like water." That was the horror of it, and Claire had known she had planned it. She had walked every room in a specific order with a legal pad 6 weeks before, and she had known exactly how a crowd travels through a house because she'd hosted 400 dinners in it. They went to the dining room because that's where a party goes, and the dining room was 23 months of rent. $12,000 a month, Ray said. He was 58 and he was on the board and he'd never liked his nephew. $12,000 a month for 2 years coded business development. Ray, that's $276,000, Alex. Ray, get away from the wall. Whose apartment is it? Ray leaned in and adjusted his glasses and read the tenant line, and then he straightened up very slowly and turned his head and looked across the room at a 29-year-old woman in a green dress. Nobody said anything. Nancy Ashford put her hand on her mouth. And Sophia Carter stood in a room where 23 copies of her own address hung on the wall and did not run, which was, Claire would think later, when she finally saw the footage, the only thing about that girl she ever came close to respecting. "Yes," Sophia said. "It's mine." "Sophia," Alexander said, "it's my apartment. He pays for it." Her chin was up and her voice cracked right down the middle. "The company pays for it. I didn't know that part until 11 minutes ago." 9:48. "Alexander," Peter sung from the doorway, still holding his phone. "I need you to not touch anything on these walls." "Peter, I'm not talking to you as your friend. I want to be very clear about that because we've had dinner 60 times and I want you to understand what's happening." Sung's voice never rose. "I'm the general counsel of this company. There is documentary evidence of misapplication of corporate assets hanging in your dining room in front of 2 directors. If a single frame comes off that wall tonight, that's spoliation and I will have to report it, and the reporting will be worse than the thing. This is my house." "It's your wife's house," Sung said. "That's actually one of the questions." 9:51. Margaret Whitmore arrived. She came through the front door at speed, and she stopped, and she took in the hall in one long look, and the extraordinary thing, the thing Charles would think about for the rest of his life, was that she did not look at the photographs. She looked at the people. She counted them. Then she said in a voice that could have cut a diamond, "Everyone out, now. This is a family matter, and you are all going home." And nobody moved. That had never happened to Margaret Whitmore before, not once, not in 68 years. "Nancy," she said. "Margaret." Nancy Ashford's voice was shaking. "Margaret, there's a wall in there with your handwriting on it." 9:53. Margaret walked into the sitting room. Alexander went after her. He got there in time to see it, and he would have given the company he would have given his own hands not to have seen it. His mother stopped in front of her own chair, and she looked down at a photograph of herself at the Four Seasons, and a schedule of 16 payments, and one word repeated 16 times. Legacy. And Margaret Whitmore, who had waited out a husband's mistress, a lawsuit, and a depression, who had never once in her life been in a hurry, made a sound. It was very small. It came out of her before she could stop it, and it was not a word, and every single person in the doorway heard it. Then she saw her deposition. Her own voice, 1998, under oath, framed and hung at eye level in the room where she'd been receiving guests for 30 years. Margaret reached out and took the frame off the wall. "Mother, don't." "Margaret." Peter sung, very quiet. "Put it back. This is my house. Put it back, Mrs. Whitmore." And Margaret Whitmore stood there holding a frame with both hands in front of 9 witnesses, and Charles Whitmore said from behind her, "Margaret." Just her name, that was all. She put it back on the wall. 9:57. "It's a lie," Alexander said. He said it to the room. He turned around in the middle of the sitting room, and he spread his hands, and he found the tone, the one that had carried him through 100 boardrooms, warm and rueful and exhausted. And Claire would later watch this moment on video 11 times, because it was the most frightening thing she had ever seen a human being do. He was good. He was so good. "Everybody," he said. "Everybody listen, please. I'm going to say something hard." Nobody spoke. "My wife is not well." Nancy Ashford said Alexander. No, let me say it. I've been carrying it for 4 years. His eyes filled. Actually filled. You all know we tried. You know what she went through. 4 rounds. 4. And after the last one, she never came back from it. Not really. And I have covered for her for 4 years because I love her, and because it wasn't anybody's business, and because I kept thinking next month she'll be okay next month. Alex, his uncle said, there's a woman in this room I've made mistakes with. I'm not going to stand here and lie to you. I've made real mistakes and I'll answer for every one of them in front of my family and in front of this board. He put his hand flat on his chest. But this wall, Ray, look at this. Look at what she's done. She hung our wedding photograph in a hallway to make a point. That is not a healthy person. That's a woman in crisis, and I'm not going to let anybody in this room use my wife's illness as a... Alexander. Charles Whitmore's voice. Dad, please. Alexander. His father was standing in the doorway to the hall. Come here. Dad, come here and look at this. 10:01. They followed him, all of them. Down the hall, past the wedding, past the Radiator in Somerville, past the hospital parking lot, through the room off the kitchen where the guest house photographs hung, and there was a small, terrible silence there because there was a yellow room and a rocking chair and a paper bag from Boylston Street and a blanket with a gold leaf on it, and Nancy Ashford turned around and walked back out and stood in the kitchen by herself for a while, and then up the stairs, to the hallway outside the master bedroom where one photograph hung alone. A woman in a chair, in a gown, not crying, looking at a window. Charles Whitmore stopped in front of it. Who took this? He said. Nobody answered. I'm asking who took this photograph. And Margaret Whitmore at the back of the group said, I did. The hallway went absolutely still. I took it on her phone, Margaret said. Her voice was perfectly level. 20 minutes after the 4th one failed. I told her one day she'd want to remember how strong she was. And then, Charles said, and then what? And then what, Margaret? And Margaret said nothing. And Peter Sung, standing at the top of the stairs, took out his phone and quietly checked a date because he was a lawyer, and lawyers check dates, and he had just been in a sitting room 3 doors away where a photograph of a lunch at the Four Seasons hung with the date printed in the margin. 6 weeks. He didn't say it. He didn't have to. He looked up and he found Charles Whitmore's eyes, and Charles Whitmore had spent 31 years reading a room, and he read that one in half a second, and he said out loud in the hallway of his son's house, How long, Margaret? Charles, how long after? You don't understand the position I was. How long? And Ray Whitmore, who had a daughter, said 6 weeks. It's 6 weeks. The date's on the picture downstairs. 10:07. Margaret Whitmore turned and walked down the stairs. She did not run. She did not stumble. She went down those stairs at the same pace she had come up them, with her back straight, past 9 people who had known her for 30 years and would never look at her the same way again, and she got to the front hall and she stopped, because the front hall was a boy with holes in his sneakers, and her son's whole life in a straight line, and a card propped against the frame in Claire's handwriting. Margaret picked it up and read it. Then she put it back exactly where it had been, straightened it with one finger, and walked out the front door into the dark and sat in her car in the circular drive for 1 hour and 40 minutes without starting the engine. Fenwick watched her the whole time from the gate. He never told anyone that. He told Claire once a year later in an email of 4 sentences, and she read it and closed the laptop and sat for a while and didn't know what she felt. 10:12. The study was last, because of course it was. Because Claire had walked this house with a legal pad, and she had known that a crowd goes to the dining room first and the study last, and she had known that by the time Alexander Whitmore got to his own desk, he would already be in pieces. And there is a difference between showing a man his crimes and showing him to a room. She had saved the room for the end. Alexander went in first. He was moving badly now, and his tie was gone, and he'd said the word unwell 4 times in 10 minutes, and he was going to say it again. He was already forming it, and he stopped behind his desk. There was paper on the wall behind his chair, page 11 of a trust instrument. "What is that?" Ray said. "Get out of my study." "Alex, what is that?" "Get out of my—" "Read it," Peter Sung said. "Peter, I'm asking you as—" "Read it out loud, Alexander." Sung's voice had changed. It had gotten very careful the way a man's voice gets when he is standing near something that might go off. Because I've been at that company 19 years, and I've never seen that document, and it has your wife's name on it, and I'd very much like to hear you read the beneficiary clause out loud. Nobody moved. And Charles Whitmore, 73 years old, with a heart like a paper bag, walked around the desk and read it himself. Then he read the next frame. A signature page. Claire's signature, perfect every loop, dated the 11th of March, 2019. Then he read the next frame. A boarding pass. Then the next. A photograph of a woman in a green coat standing in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, time-stamped 2 in the afternoon on the 11th of March, 2019, 6,000 miles from a notary in Back Bay, who had sworn under seal that Claire Whitmore had appeared before her in person. Charles Whitmore put his hand on the desk. "Dad," Alexander said, "whose land is this?" "Dad, sit down. Whose land is this, Alexander?" "It's family land. It's in the family entity. It's her grandmother's." Charles's voice had gone somewhere terrible. "It's her father's 40 acres in Vermont. She told me about it. She told me about the horse and the wall and her great-grandfather at Christmas in 2012 in that chair, and she cried and you were in the kitchen." "Dad, and in 2019 you changed it so it passes to your children." Silence. "To lineal descendants of Alexander Whitmore." Charles read, "She doesn't have any. You knew she didn't have any. You wrote that in 2019 and she was still going to the clinic in 2021. It was tax planning. You forged her name. It was tax. You forged her name." 10:17. Charles Whitmore had not raised his voice in that house since 1994. The whole room jumped, and Alexander broke. "She wasn't going to have children." It came out of him at full volume, ugly, from somewhere underneath everything, and the second it was out of his mouth, his face changed, because he heard it too. She wasn't. Everyone in this room knew it. The doctors knew it in year 2. And somebody had to plan. Somebody had to actually think about what happens to 140 years, and you were sick, and Mother was, and I was the only one. I was the only one sitting there doing the math. "Alexander, you want to talk about the land? Fine, fine. That land is worth $400,000, and it has a house on it that's falling into a hole, and she was never going to go there. She never went there, not once in 14 years. "Because her father died there," Charles said. Alexander stopped. "She couldn't go there because her father died there," his father said, "and she asked you to handle the paperwork because she couldn't look at it, and you handled it." 10:19. Nobody spoke for a long time, and then Peter Sung said quietly from the doorway, "Alexander, I have to notify the board tonight. I want you to hear it from me, and not from a letter." "Peter." "There's a forged instrument on the wall of your study in front of 2 directors and outside counsel's client. I don't have discretion. There's no version of this where I have discretion." "Peter, we've had dinner 62, Sung said. "I counted on the drive over, and every one of them you called me buddy." He put his phone in his pocket and walked out. 10:22. The house emptied. That was the part Alexander had never once imagined in any of the 10,000 scenarios he'd run in his head over 2 years, and he'd run them all. He was a man who ran scenarios. He'd imagined screaming. He'd imagined a lawsuit. He'd imagined Claire on the floor. He'd imagined his mother handling it. He had never imagined people just leaving. Nancy Ashford got her coat. Ray got his coat. The board members left without saying goodbye, which is the single most eloquent thing a board member can do. The woman from the gala committee stopped in the hall on her way out and stood in front of the photograph of Claire in the hospital chair for a moment, and then she took out her phone and did something, and Alexander said, Hey, what are you doing?" And she looked at him. She was 61 years old, and she had called his wife twice a week for 9 years, and had never once gotten a call back, and she had believed all this time that Claire had simply outgrown her. "I'm writing down her name," she said. "The lawyer. It's on the card by the door." And she left. 10:31. Sophia Carter was in the kitchen. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the island in a green dress, and Alexander came in and stood over her and said, "We have to talk about the timeline." She laughed. It wasn't a good laugh. The timeline. Sophia, listen to me. There's a way through this. There is always a way through this. I need you to not talk to anybody for 48 hours. I'm 11 weeks, she said. I know. Do you... She looked up. Her makeup was gone. She looked about 19. Because I've been sitting here for 20 minutes and I've been trying to remember one time, Alexander, when you said the word baby before your mother did. Sophia. She called me. Before you did. When the test came back, she called me first. Sophia's voice was very flat. How did she know before you? Silence. Alexander, how did your mother know before you? And he said nothing. Because there was no answer. And they both knew there was no answer. And Sophia Carter got up off the kitchen floor of a mansion she had spent 2 years believing she was going to live in and picked up her bag. I'm going to my apartment, she said. It's not your apartment. She stopped. He heard it about a half second after he said it. No, Sophia said. I guess it isn't. 10:50. Alexander walked the house alone. Every light was on. Claire had left every light on, and he understood walking through it that this was deliberate too, that she had thought about the lights, that a woman had stood in this hall with a legal pad and thought about the lights. He went into the sitting room and stood in front of the payments. He went into the dining room and stood in front of the chart. He read next year, and he said out loud to nobody, I meant it. And the terrible thing, the thing that would keep him awake for 11 months, was that it was true. He had meant it. In that hour at that table with a pen in his hand, he had absolutely meant it. And he had meant it the way you mean things you have no intention of doing, warmly, sincerely, completely, for exactly as long as you're saying them. He went into the library and read the messages on the wall. You don't tell a woman like Claire while she's still trying. You wait till she stops. He'd written that. He'd written it in 11 seconds on a Tuesday and gone back to a meeting. 11:14. He called Fenwick. Sir? The cameras. Sir. Tonight, interior. I want it gone. There was a pause on the line. That'd take a written order, Mr. Whitmore? Then I'll write it. From a Whitmore, sir, and there's a note in the system as of 6 weeks ago, says all deletion requests route to the general counsel's office. Fenwick's voice was completely, beautifully neutral. That'd be Mr. Sung. Alexander closed his eyes. Fenwick. Sir? You opened the gate. Yes, sir. 9:30 like you told me. You let her in this house today. Sir, Mrs. Whitmore lives here. You. Alexander's voice cracked. You watched her do this and you didn't call me. And Fenwick, who had stood at that gate for 6 years, said, Mr. Whitmore, in 6 years you never once asked me anything. Not my name, not my kid's name, nothing. Tonight's the first time you've ever called this phone. A pause. 6 years, sir. You called me Buddy. He hung up. 11:40. Alexander Whitmore ended up in the front hall. He sat down on the floor across from the very first photograph, the one hanging alone with 4 feet of white plaster all around it, and he looked at a kid with holes in his sneakers outside a coffee shop on Newbury Street. He looked at him for a long time. And then he said out loud, in an empty house with every light burning, What did you do? Nobody answered. At the same moment, 6,000 miles away, it was 5:40 in the morning, and the sky over Paris had just started to go gray, and a woman came up out of a train station with one bag and stopped on the sidewalk. She'd flown out of Providence under the name Bennett. Her phone had been off for 11 hours. Claire stood there in the cold and turned it on, and it took 40 seconds, and then it started. 41 missed calls. Voicemails, texts, a message from Victoria Hayes at 11:02 p.m. Boston time that said only, It's done. Peter Sung notified the board, Don't read anything else tonight. And one from a number she didn't know sent at 11:50. It's Rosa. I don't work there anymore. I quit at 10 o'clock, and I want you to know I told them why in front of everybody. Mrs. Whitmore, I set that table for you 600 times. God bless you. Claire stood on a sidewalk in a city where nobody knew her name, and then she put the phone in her coat pocket without answering a single one, and she picked up her bag and she walked. She walked for 2 hours. That was the part nobody ever believed afterward when they asked her about that morning, when journalists asked, and friends asked, and eventually her own lawyer asked. They all wanted to know what she felt when the phone lit up with 41 missed calls on a sidewalk in the 6th arrondissement at 5:40 in the morning. The truth was nothing. She walked because her legs worked, and the bag had a strap and the city was empty, and somewhere around 7:15, she sat down outside a place that had just opened, and a man put coffee in front of her without asking, and she drank it, and that was when it hit her. Not grief. Hunger. She hadn't eaten since a turkey sandwich in a hallway 6,000 miles away. Claire Bennett sat on a folding chair on a wet sidewalk and ate 2 croissants like an animal and started laughing, and she couldn't stop, and the man came back out and looked at her with real concern and said something she didn't understand, and she said, I'm sorry, I'm fine, I'm fine. And she was. That was the thing that would embarrass her for years. On the worst morning of her life on the far side of the ocean with her entire past on fire. Behind her, Claire Bennett was sitting in the cold, eating pastry, and feeling for the first time since she was 26, completely awake. At 8:10, Victoria Hayes called. Are you sitting down? I'm sitting down. Where? A sidewalk. Good enough. Papers moving. It was 2 in the morning in Boston, and Victoria Hayes had not slept and did not sound like it. Peter Sung notified the board at 11:02, emergency meeting Thursday. Your husband has been asked in writing to voluntarily refrain from company communications until then. Asked. It's a courtesy. It's the last one he'll get. A pause. Claire, I need you to understand what happened last night because you're going to hear 100 versions of it and most of them will be wrong. You didn't beat him. I know. No, listen to me because this is the thing people get wrong for the rest of their lives. Victoria's voice sharpened. You didn't do anything to him. Not one thing. Everything on those walls was already true at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. The lease was already $12,000 a month. The trust already said what it said. You didn't add a single fact to that man's life. Then what did I do? You stopped being the only person who knew. Claire looked at the street. That's all it was, Victoria said. 10 years you were the only room those facts could live in, and you got tired of being the room. At 8:30, Claire went to the Institute. She had a fellowship. It was real. That was the thing that would take her 3 weeks to accept Alexander had actually made the calls. He had actually leaned on someone. The most generous thing he had ever done for her had been done specifically and exclusively to get her out of the country, and it was still factually the most generous thing he had ever done for her. The director's name was Elise Marchand. She was 62, she had forearms like a stonemason, and she looked at Claire's file for 11 seconds and then closed it. You are the American. Yes. The one whose husband called us. Claire went still. 4 times, Elise said. He called 4 times. He was very charming. He offered us money for a wing. I didn't know that. We did not take the money. Elise leaned back. We took you because of the Ghirlandaio, the panel from 2006. That was you. That was 19 years ago. Yes. And then nothing. 19 years of nothing from a woman who at 23 did work I would not have trusted to a man of 40. Elise's eyes were flat and hard. So, where have you been? And Claire opened her mouth to say something graceful, the thing she'd said at 400 dinners, the thing about family and priorities and how lucky she was, and she couldn't. She stood in an office in Paris at 8:30 in the morning, and her throat closed and nothing came out, and Elise Marchand watched her for a moment and then said quietly, "Ah, I'm sorry." "Don't." Elise stood up. "Come. You will not talk this morning. You will work." "I haven't held a scalpel in 19 years. "Then your hands will be terrible and we will both be disappointed, and tomorrow they will be slightly less terrible." Elise opened the door. "This is the entire profession, madame. There is no other part." At 11 that morning, Boston time, Alexander Whitmore woke up on the floor of his front hall. Every light was still on. He'd slept 4 hours in a suit, and his phone was dead, and his mouth tasted like copper, and he lay there looking at a photograph of himself at 22, and the first coherent thought he had was, I can fix this. That was the thing about Alexander. He never once thought otherwise. Not that night, not that week, not for 11 months. It was not arrogance exactly. It was more like a religion he'd been raised in and had never encountered a serious argument against. He got up. He charged his phone. He made coffee in his own kitchen for the first time in years and burned it. And while it dripped, he wrote a list on the back of an envelope because he was a man who wrote lists. Peter, Ray, Dad, Board Thursday, Claire. He looked at that last one for a while. Then he crossed out everything above it. At 11:40, he called her. It went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called 11 more times over 90 minutes, and then he sat down and wrote a text that was 400 words long and deleted it and wrote one that was 11 words long. I know what I am. Please, just tell me you're safe. 6,000 miles away in a basement room with the smell of solvent in it. Claire's phone buzzed face down on a bench, and she didn't look at it for 6 hours. When she finally did, she read it once, and she felt it. That was the part that frightened her. Daniel Brooks had warned her sitting in an office 6 weeks before with his hand flat on a folder, and she had thought she was above it, and she was not above it, and it took her at the knees exactly the way he'd said it would. She read, "I know what I am," and 18 years of muscle memory stood straight up in her chest and said, "Go to him." Claire put the phone down. She picked up the scalpel. And she thought very deliberately about a legal pad with a chart on it and a number circled at the bottom and 2 words in her husband's handwriting. Then she went back to work. Thursday, 9 in the morning, Boston. The board of Whitmore Holdings met for 4 hours and 11 minutes. Alexander was not in the room. That was the whole story right there, and everyone in that building knew it by 9:10. He'd come in at 8:30 in a good suit with a leather folder and a plan, and Peter Sung had met him in the lobby, in front of the security desk, in front of the receptionist, in front of 2 analysts waiting for the elevator, and said, "Alexander, you're not going upstairs." "Peter, you're not going upstairs, and I'm not going to argue with you in a lobby. This is my company. It's a public company with an independent board and a general counsel, and you're a director and an officer and a subject." Sung's voice never went above conversational. "Go home. If you go up there and try to speak, I have to memorialize it, and every word you say becomes a document with your name on it. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I'm doing you a favor, and it's the last one." And Alexander Whitmore stood in the lobby of a building his grandfather had built. "You called me buddy for 6 years, Sung said quietly. "I never once corrected you. That's on me." At 10:40, the board voted to retain outside counsel. At 11:15, they voted to open a special investigation. At 12:20, Ray Whitmore made a motion, and it passed 9-2, and the 2 were an old friend of Charles's and a man who owed Margaret a favor from 2004. Alexander Whitmore was placed on administrative leave, not fired. That was important. That was the part the newspapers got wrong for 3 weeks. You don't fire a Whitmore from Whitmore Holdings in a morning. You put him on leave and you announce an investigation and you let the arithmetic do the rest. At 1 o'clock, Charles Whitmore drove himself home. He hadn't driven himself anywhere in 6 years. He got there and he sat in the car in his own garage for a long time, and then he came in, and Margaret was in the kitchen, and she had made lunch, and she had set the table, and Charles Whitmore stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at his wife of 46 years. "Sit down," Margaret said. "It's the soup you like." "Margaret." "Charles, sit." 6 weeks, he said. She kept slicing bread. 6 weeks after that girl's 4th miscarriage, you had lunch at the Four Seasons." "Yes." He hadn't expected that. She looked up and she was perfectly calm, and she said it again. "Yes, I did, in April. You were in and out of Mass General with your heart, and Alexander was drinking, and I was watching 140 years walk into a wall, and I had lunch. You picked her. I picked a solution. You picked a woman for our son while his wife was still going to the clinic." "Yes." Margaret set the knife down. "And what were you doing, Charles?" Silence. "What were you doing?" Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. "I'll tell you. You were being cared for. You've been cared for since 1979. You've never once in your life had to look at the arithmetic because there has always been a woman in this house doing it in the next room, and you have always been able to be the kind man, the sad man, the man who raises his voice once every 30 years, and everybody weeps. She picked the knife back up. I did what your mother did. I did what her mother did. The only difference is nobody's ever hung it on a wall before. Charles Whitmore put both hands on the back of a chair. Did you tell him? Tell him what? Did you tell our son to forge that girl's name? And Margaret said no. Margaret. No, Charles. And for the first time, something moved in her face. I did not. I didn't know about the trust until I read it on the wall of his study on Tuesday night, standing next to Nancy Ashford. Her hands had gone still. I built a great deal. I'll answer for all of it, but I didn't build that. Then what did you think was going to happen to her? I thought she'd take $11 million and go to Paris and be happier. Margaret's voice cracked for exactly one syllable, and then it was gone, sealed over 30 years of practice. I thought I was being kind, Charles. That's the part you'll never understand about me. I have never once in my life done a cruel thing that I didn't first find a way to call kind. She turned around and put the bread on the table. Sit down, she said. It's getting cold. And Charles Whitmore did not sit down. He went upstairs and he packed a bag badly the way a man packs who has never packed, and he came back down at 2:40 with it in his hand. Margaret was still at the table. Where will you go? She said. Ray's. Ray's, she almost smiled. You'll be back Sunday. There's nothing in Ray's refrigerator but beer and a lime. Probably, Charles said, and he left. He came back 9 days later, which was, everyone agreed, both longer and shorter than anyone expected. Friday, 6 in the evening, Paris. Claire's hands were shaking so badly, she had to put the scalpel down. Elise saw it from across the room. Stop. I'm fine. You are not fine. You're doing 11 hours a day like a person running from a dog. Elise came over. Give me your hands. Elise, give me the hands. Claire held them out. They were a wreck. 2 blisters a cut across the pad of the thumb, and the tremor she had been ignoring for 4 days. Elise held them for a moment, and then she said, How long since you slept? I sleep. How long? I don't know. A few hours a night. And you are eating? Yes. What did you eat today? Silence. Elise let go of her hands. Sit, she said, and pulled a stool over and sat down herself, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Elise said, In 1991, my husband left me for a girl who worked in a shop. He took the apartment because it was his mother's. I had a daughter who was 4. Claire looked up. I worked in a basement for 2 years, Elise said. Like this one. And I told myself I am fine. Look at my hands. Look how much work I am doing. And one day I put a scalpel through a panel from 1560 and destroyed 6 months of work in half a second because I had not slept in 9 days and I was not restoring the painting. What were you doing? I was hiding in it. Elise stood up. Go home, madame. It will still be here. I don't have a home. You have a room. It's not the same thing. No, Elise agreed. It is not, but you must sleep in something. At 7:15, Claire went back to the apartment the Institute had given her. It was 1 room and a hot plate and a window that looked at a wall. She sat down on the bed in her coat, and she did not take it off for 40 minutes. And then finally she opened her email. 411 messages. She read 3. The first was from Nancy Ashford, and it was 2 lines long. I called you every week for 9 years. I want you to know I never once thought you'd forgotten me. I thought you'd been taken. The second was from a woman named Diane from the Gala Committee, and it said I got the lawyer's name off your card. Not for you, for me. 31 years. I never had the words for it until I stood in your hallway. The third was from Rosa. Mrs. Whitmore, I set your table 600 times, and every time I put out 2 plates, and one of them was for a man who was somewhere else. I quit at 10 o'clock in front of Mr. Ray and Mrs. Ashford, and I said out loud, why? I have never done anything like that in my life. My daughter says I am famous now in the kitchen at the club. God bless you. Please eat something. Claire read that one 4 times. Then she got up, and she went out, and she bought a rotisserie chicken and a bag of green beans and a pot because she didn't own a pot, and she cooked in a room the size of a car and ate sitting on the floor. And then she cried. Not the way she'd cried on the floor of Alexander's study. That had been a bomb going off. This was slower and worse. And it went on for 2 hours, and around 10 at night, she was lying on her back on the floor of a rented room in Paris with a plate on her stomach saying out loud to nobody, "I want to go home." And then at 10:15 she said out loud, "Where?" And there was no answer. That was the night Claire would say later that was actually the bottom, not the mansion, not the guest house, not the envelope. A floor in Paris and a woman asking herself where home was and finding out there wasn't one, hadn't been one for a decade, and that she'd built the whole thing herself out of somebody else's furniture. Monday, 10 in the morning, Boston. The first article ran. It was 600 words in a business section, and it was very careful, and it used the word allegations 4 times, and it did not mention a mistress, and it did not mention photographs on a wall. It mentioned an internal investigation into the use of corporate assets. That was all it took. By noon, the stock was down 4%. By Wednesday, it was down 11%. And on Wednesday afternoon, a woman named Karen Whitlock, who had worked in accounts payable at Whitmore Holdings for 22 years and had processed a certain recurring $12,000 disbursement 111 times without ever once being able to get anyone to look her in the eye about it, called the number in the article. That was the thing nobody planned. Claire hadn't planned it. Victoria hadn't planned it. Daniel had said it once offhand in an office in March, and Claire hadn't understood it at the time. "Here's what people don't get about a company," Daniel had said. "Everybody already knows, not the details, but there's always somebody in accounting always who's been carrying a number around in her purse for 2 years. She's not a whistleblower, she's not brave, she's just tired. And she's been waiting for the exact moment when telling the truth stops costing her more than keeping it." Karen Whitlock talked for 6 hours. By Friday, the investigation wasn't about Elise anymore. At 2 in the afternoon on that Friday, Alexander Whitmore called Victoria Hayes. "Ms. Hayes, this is." "I know who this is." "Papers. Alexander is your counsel on this line." "No." "Then this call is over." "Wait, please." And there was something in it that made her wait. "I just want to know if she's okay. That's it. That's the whole call. I'm not going to ask you anything about the case. I swear to God, I just want somebody to tell me she's eating." Victoria Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Alexander, I'm going to give you one thing off the record, and then you're going to hang up and never call this number again without your lawyer. Okay? She's fine. Is she?" "Hang up," Victoria said. And he did. And then she sat there for a second, and she rubbed her eyes, and she said to an empty office, "God, you're good." Because that was the thing about Alexander Whitmore. He meant it, every second of it. He meant it the way he'd meant next year, and the way he'd meant "I notice everything about you," and the way he'd meant the tears on the edge of the bathtub in November, 3 days before he bought a $16,000 bracelet for someone else. It wasn't strategy. That would have been easier. Strategy, you can fight. Alexander Whitmore had a heart that worked perfectly for about 90 seconds at a time. 6 weeks in the settlement talks started. They lasted 11 minutes. Alexander's lawyer was a man named Bristow who had done this for 30 years and had never lost a Whitmore anything, and he came into the room with a number and a speech, and Victoria Hayes let him finish both. Then she opened a folder. "Before you say anything else," she said, "I want to show you page 11. Bristow read it. Then he read the signature page. Then he read a boarding pass and looked at a photograph of a woman in a green coat standing in the Uffizi Gallery at 2 in the afternoon on the 11th of March, 2019. And Bristow, who was 64 years old, put the folder down and turned to his client and said, "Alexander, I'd like the room." "Ted, I'd like the room, please." 14 minutes later, Bristow came out alone and said, "Victoria, give me a week. You have 4 days. Vicky, 4 days, Ted. And I want you to hear me clearly because I've known you 20 years, and I don't want you to walk into a wall." Victoria Hayes stood up and buttoned her jacket. "This isn't a divorce anymore. It stopped being a divorce the second a notary in Back Bay swore that my client was standing in front of her while she was in Italy. You don't have a client with a marriage problem. You have a client with a document problem, and documents don't cry, and documents don't get better with time." "What does she want?" Victoria stopped at the door. "Her land back," she said. "That's it. That's the whole ask. 40 acres in Vermont with a house falling into a hole. Bristow stared at her. Vicky, that parcel's worth $400,000. She's entitled to somewhere north of $11 million. I know. Then what is this? And Victoria Hayes said, Ted, in 22 years, I've never had a client like this, and I'm not going to have another one. She doesn't want the money. She'll take it because I'm going to make her take it because I'm her lawyer and I'm not insane. But that's not what she called me about. Then what did she call you about? She called me, Victoria said, because a man wrote her name in his own handwriting until he got the loops right. That night, Alexander drove to Vermont. He didn't tell anyone. He got in the car at 9 at night and drove 3.5 hours in the dark and pulled up a dirt road at midnight with his headlights on a house he had never once seen. He got out. 40 acres. A stone wall a man had built with a horse. A house with a hole in the roof and a porch that had come away from the front of it and a tree in the yard the size of a church. Alexander Whitmore stood in the weeds in a $4,000 suit and looked at $400,000 of nothing. And he understood all at once, standing in the dark at midnight, what he had actually done. Not the lease, not the girl, not the guest house. He had taken the only 40 acres on earth that Claire Bennett had not gotten from him. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. Everything she owned, she'd owned because of him. The house, the car, the clothes, the charities, her calendar, her friends, the entire apparatus of her life. All of it had come out of his hand, and she had been grateful, and he had liked her being grateful. And there had been exactly one thing in 14 years that had come to her from somewhere he had never been. And in 2019, at a desk alone with a pen, he had gone and gotten that too. Alexander sat down on the ruined porch of his wife's grandmother's house and put his head in his hands and made a sound that nobody heard. He drove back at 4 a.m. At 6, he sent one message. I went to Vermont. That was all. 3 words. Claire read it at noon Paris time, standing in a basement with a scalpel in her hand, and she read it 11 times, and then she put the phone in a drawer and closed the drawer and worked for 6 more hours. But that night, she got out a laptop and typed his name into a search bar for the first time since she'd left, and found the second article. This one wasn't in a business section. 3 months in Sophia Carter gave a deposition. Bristow tried to stop it. He tried 3 ways. He lost all 3 because Sophia Carter was not a party to the divorce. She was a witness in a corporate investigation, and Peter Sung's outside counsel had a subpoena and a very short temper. She sat down at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday, 5 months pregnant, and answered questions for 7 hours. And on hour 4, a lawyer said, Ms. Carter, did anyone ever instruct you to communicate with Claire Whitmore? And Sophia said, yes. Everyone in the room stopped writing. Who? Margaret Whitmore. When? February. Last year. Sophia's voice was flat and dead. She called me and said the timeline had stalled. She said Alexander wouldn't move while Claire was still trying, and Claire had stopped trying, and Alexander still wasn't moving. She said some men need the decision made for them. And what did she instruct you to do? She said I should let Claire find out. Did she tell you how? No. She said she didn't want to know how. Sophia looked up. That's exactly what she said. She said, don't tell me how, dear, just let her find out. And what did you do? And Sophia Carter, 29 years old, 5 months pregnant, in a conference room on the 22nd floor, said, I photographed my own relationship, and I mailed it to his wife's house 3 times. I drove up myself at 6 a.m. so it wouldn't have a postmark. Silence. Why yourself? Because I wanted to see the house, Sophia said. Nobody said anything for a while. Miss Carter, do you understand what you've just described? And Sophia said, yes, I've had 11 weeks to understand it. She paused. I stood at the end of the driveway, she said, and I looked up at her bedroom window, and I thought she gets to sleep in there, and I don't, and that's not fair. That's what I thought. That's the whole thing I was thinking. I was 29 years old, and I stood in the dark outside a woman's house at 6 a.m. holding a photograph of myself kissing her husband, and I thought about fairness. At 6 that evening, Claire got a call. It's Daniel. Daniel, you need to sit down. Daniel, everyone in America keeps telling me to sit down. What is it? He told her, and Claire Bennett stood in a basement in Paris and listened to a private investigator read a transcript out loud. And when he got to the part about the driveway, she said, Stop. Claire, stop. Go back. She said what? She said she wanted to see the house. Claire put her hand on the bench. She wasn't warning me, she said. No. She was shopping. Yeah, Daniel said quietly. She stood at the end of my driveway and looked at my window and thought about fairness. Claire. Daniel, that girl was in my house. Claire's voice had gone somewhere strange. Her coat was on my hook. At my mother-in-law's birthday lunch, she ate a piece of my mother-in-law's cake in my dining room in a cream coat with a gold leaf on the collar, and I complimented it, and Margaret told me not to fuss. Silence on the line. And now she's 5 months pregnant, and she's sitting in a conference room understanding it 11 weeks too late. Do you feel sorry for her? And Claire thought about it. She actually thought about it standing there for 11 full seconds. No, she said. Then, yes. Then, I don't know, Daniel, and I'm so tired of being the person who has to decide. 4 months in, Margaret Whitmore lost the Fairfield Foundation. It wasn't a vote. There was no vote. That's not how those places work. What happened was that Nancy Ashford stopped returning calls. And then 2 other women stopped returning calls. And then a nominating committee met in April, as it met every April, and Margaret Whitmore's name was simply not on the list, and nobody said why, and nobody had to. Margaret found out from a mailing. She got the spring newsletter in her own mailbox, in a house her family had owned since 1881, and she opened it, standing at the kitchen counter, and read the list of trustees for the coming year, and her name was not on it, and she stood there for a long time. Then she called Nancy. Nancy picked up on the 4th ring. Margaret? Nancy. It's about the newsletter. I think there hasn't been a mistake. Silence. Nancy, 31 years. I know how long it's been. Nancy Ashford's voice was shaking, which was the terrible part because it meant she'd rehearsed it. Margaret, I have been standing in your kitchen since 1994. I have raised money with you and buried people with you, and I sat with you the whole night your husband was in surgery. Yes, and I stood in your son's hallway in November, and I looked at a photograph of that girl in a hospital chair. Nancy's breath caught. And 3 rooms away there was a lunch at the Four Seasons with a date on it, and I did the math standing up, Margaret. In my coat. I did the math in my coat. Nancy, 6 weeks. You don't understand the position. Don't. Nancy's voice broke completely. Don't say that to me. Don't you dare say that to me. My daughter had 3 miscarriages, Margaret. 3. And you sat at my table and you held my hand and you said, these girls are stronger than we ever were. Silence. Did you mean it? Nothing. Margaret, when you said that to me, did you mean it? And Margaret Whitmore, 68 years old, standing at a kitchen counter with a newsletter in her hand, said, I meant it at the time. And Nancy Ashford said, God help you, and hung up. 6 months and the divorce ended, not with a trial. There was never going to be a trial. Bristow had known that in the first 14 minutes. It ended in a conference room on a Tuesday morning at 9, and Alexander was there and Claire was not. She was on a video screen. That had been Victoria's idea, and Claire had fought it for 2 weeks because part of her, some ancient part, had wanted to be in the room, had wanted to sit across from him and let him look at her. No, Victoria had said. Why? Because that's the last thing you can give him, and you're not going to give it to him. Victoria had leaned forward. Claire, listen to me. He has been trying to get in a room with you for 6 months. Every letter, every message, every call to my office. Why do you think that is? Because he's sorry. Yes, he is. Victoria's voice was flat. He's genuinely, deeply sorry, and he will cry, and he'll mean it, and that man has never in his life failed to move a person who is in the room with him. Not once. It's the only thing he's ever been truly great at. So I'm afraid of him. No, Victoria said. You're afraid of you. Claire hadn't answered that. Do it on a screen, Victoria had said. Not because you're weak, because you're not a room he gets to be in anymore. So at 9 a.m. Boston time on a Tuesday in the spring, Alexander Whitmore signed 22 pages and looked up at a screen where his wife was sitting in a basement in Paris in a work smock with her hair up. Claire. Alexander. Bristow said, Alexander, I'm going to advise. Ted in a minute." He didn't look away from the screen. "Claire, can I say one thing?" Victoria's hand came into frame, reaching for the mute. Claire said, "No, let him." And Alexander Whitmore, 41 years old, who had never lost a story in his life, opened his mouth and nothing came out. 11 seconds. The room watched a man try to speak and fail, and then he said, "I practiced." Claire didn't move. "Your name," he said. "I practiced your name. Nobody knows that. It's not in any of the filings. They've got the notary and the boarding pass and the timestamp. They don't have this part." His voice was completely steady, and his face was coming apart. "I sat at my desk on a Thursday with a legal pad, and I did it maybe 60 times. Because the loops, you do a thing with the C where you go back through it. Alexander. And it took me about an hour, and then I did it, and I put the pad through the shredder, and I went to a dinner." He stopped. "I went to a dinner, Claire, that night. I forged my wife's name on her dead father's land, and then I went to Grill 23, and I had the swordfish." Victoria Hayes was writing nothing. Nobody in that room was writing anything. "I've been trying for 6 months to find the moment," he said. "Everybody keeps asking me. My father asks me. Ted asks me. When did it start? When did you decide? And I keep looking. And Claire, there's no moment. There isn't one. I never decided anything." "I know," Claire said. He looked up. "I know," she said again. "That's the part I understood in November." "What?" "You didn't choose her over me." Claire's voice was very quiet and very clear, and it carried across 6,000 miles into a room full of lawyers. "You never chose anything. You just kept doing the next easy thing, and each one was small, and you were never once in your whole life required to look at the pile." Alexander put his hand over his mouth. "That's what the walls were," Claire said. "Everybody thinks it was revenge. It wasn't. I just put the pile where you could see it." Silence. "Claire," he said, "please, can I ask you one question?" "Ask." "When did you stop?" And Claire Bennett looked into a camera and thought about it honestly, and then she said, "The lunch." "What lunch?" "Your mother's birthday, 3 weeks before the first envelope." Claire's hands were folded and completely still. "There was a cream coat on the hook by my front door with a gold leaf on the collar, and I asked whose it was, and your mother said one of the girls from Alexander's office. Don't fuss, Claire." Alexander closed his eyes. "And I said okay," Claire said, "and I went and refilled the water pitcher." "Oh, God." "I stood in my own kitchen with a pitcher in my hand, and I thought, don't fuss. And I went back out, and I was charming, and I was lovely, and I did not fuss." Claire's chin came up 1/2 inch. "That's when, not the photographs, the picture." Alexander Whitmore, in a conference room on the 18th floor in front of his lawyer and his wife's lawyer and a court reporter and a woman on a screen, put his head down on 22 pages of a signed settlement and wept like something breaking. And Claire watched. She watched the whole thing, and she did not cry, and she did not look away. And afterward, Victoria Hayes would say it was the single most disciplined thing she'd ever seen a human being do. But it wasn't discipline. Claire found that out about 4 hours later, alone in a basement, when it finally hit her what she'd actually felt sitting there watching her husband of 14 years come apart on a screen. She'd felt sorry for him. Really sorry. The real thing. The way you'd feel for anybody. And nothing else. Not love, not hate, not the terrible pull she'd braced for the one Daniel had warned her would take her at the knees. Just a plain, ordinary human pity, the kind you'd feel for a stranger in an airport. And Claire Bennett sat down on a stool in a basement in Paris and understood that the man she had been married to for 14 years had become somebody she did not know. That was the last thing to go. Not the marriage. The marriage had died at a birthday lunch with a water pitcher in her hand. The last thing to go was the belief that she'd ever known him at all. At 7 that night, she called Victoria. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." "Always am. It's my whole personality." "The land," Claire said. "The Vermont land." "You got it back. It's yours. It's been yours since 9:40 this morning." "I know." Claire looked at the wall. "Victoria, why did I want it?" Victoria Hayes was quiet for a second. "Say more." "I never go there. I haven't been there since my father died in 2011. It's 40 acres of trees and a house that's falling into a hole, and I don't want to live in Vermont. I've never wanted to live in Vermont." Claire's voice was shaking, and it hadn't shaken in 6 months. "You could have gotten me $22 million. Ted Bristow would have paid $22 million to keep that trust document out of a courtroom, and we both know it. And I said no. I said, give me the trees." "Yeah," Victoria said. "You did. Why?" And Victoria Hayes, who had done this for 22 years and had never once said anything like this to a client, said, "Because it's the only thing you ever owned that he didn't hand you." Claire didn't answer. "Claire, in 22 years, I've watched about 400 women take the money. Every single one of them was entitled to it, and every single one of them was right to take it, and I'd do it again tomorrow." Papers stopped moving. "But there's a thing that happens to them afterward. About year 2. They call me, and they say, 'Vicky, I've got the house, and I've got the account, and I've got the settlement, and I still feel like I'm living on his money.' Because they are. Because they are." A pause. "You took $11 million. I made you. I'm your lawyer. That's my job, and you'll be glad in 10 years. But you asked me for 40 acres of trees, and I want you to know that in 22 years, you're the first person who ever asked me for the one thing that was already hers." Claire sat on the floor of a rented room. "It's not about the land," she said. "No, sweetheart," Victoria said. "It's about the loops." 9 months in, Claire went back once. Not to Boston, never to Boston, to Vermont. She flew into Burlington on a Thursday in October and rented a car and drove 90 minutes and turned up a dirt road she hadn't driven since she was 32 years old and her father was 6 days dead. And she stopped at the top. There was a house with a hole in the roof. There was a stone wall. There was a tree the size of a church. And Claire Bennett got out of a rental car and stood in the weeds in the cold and did the things she had not done in the mansion, or in the courtroom, or on the screen. She said out loud to 40 acres of trees, "Dad, I'm sorry it took me so long." And then she sat down on the porch her great-grandfather built on the step in her coat and stayed there until it got dark. At some point, she noticed that somebody had cut the grass. Not all of it. Just a path from the road to the porch about 6 feet wide, mowed with something bad, unevenly by a person who had clearly never mowed anything before in his life. Claire looked at it for a long time. Then she got in the car and drove to Burlington and got on a plane and never once in the 11 years that followed asked anybody about it. She already knew. The studio opened in the spring, 14 months after Paris. It was not a grand thing. It was 2 rooms and a bench and a light table in a building where the elevator worked most days, and Elise Marchand came to the opening and stood in the middle of it with her arms folded and said, "It is too small." "It's what I could afford." "You have $11 million. "I have $11 million I've never touched," Claire said. "This is what I could afford." Elise looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Ah," the same way she had said it in an office at 8:30 in the morning on the worst week of Claire's life, and she never brought up the money again. The first client was a woman named Sylvie, who came in with a photograph in a shopping bag. Not a painting. A photograph. It had been in a flood. It was a wedding, 1961, and it was a ruin, and Sylvie put it on the bench and said in bad English, "They say it is impossible." Claire looked at it for 11 minutes. Then she said, "It's not impossible. It's expensive." "How much?" "More than it's worth." And Sylvie said, "How much?" Claire told her. And Sylvie, who was 74, reached into her coat and took out an envelope of cash, and Claire understood standing there that this woman had come with the money already counted, that she'd been carrying it around for weeks, going from studio to studio, hearing the word impossible. "It's my mother," Sylvie said. "It is the only one where she is laughing." Claire took the job. It took 9 weeks. It should have taken 4. She did it in the evenings after the paying work, and she did not charge for the extra 5. And when Sylvie came to pick it up, she stood at the bench and did not touch it and did not speak for about 30 seconds. Then she said, "That's her." And then she said it again louder to nobody. "That's her. That's her mouth. That's exactly her mouth." And Claire Bennett stood in her own studio in her own smock and watched a 74-year-old woman meet her mother again and thought this. This is what I gave up for a house. That was how the studio got its reputation, not from the museums. The museums came later and they paid better and they mattered less. It got its reputation because Sylvie told her sister, and her sister told a woman at church, and within 2 years there was a waiting list of people carrying shopping bags, and Claire Bennett became known across 3 arrondissements as the American who took the impossible ones. She hired 2 people, then 4. She was 51 years old, and she had never in her life had a business card with her own name on it. The first time she got one, she sat in her car for a while. At some point in the 3rd year, the letters started. Not from Alexander. He had stopped after Vermont, and that was the thing she never told anyone, that he had stopped, and that stopping was the only genuinely selfless thing he ever did. The letters were from strangers, because the story had gotten out the way stories do, not the newspapers, which had covered a corporate investigation in 600 careful words. The other way. Nancy Ashford told it at a lunch. A woman from a gala committee told it to her sister. Rosa told it in the kitchen at a club in Newton, and 111 women in eastern Massachusetts heard about a wall of photographs from a woman who set the table for it, and then somebody put it online and it went where those things go. Claire got the first letter in March. It was from a woman in Ohio. It was 4 pages handwritten, and the 4th page said, "I am 58. I have known for 11 years. I have known for 11 years, and I have never said it out loud to a single person, and I am saying it to you because you are a stranger, and it doesn't count. Thank you for letting me say it once." Claire read it in her studio at 9 at night. Then she wrote back. That was the part nobody knew about her, the part that never made it into any version of the story. Over 11 years, Claire Bennett answered every single letter, 340 of them, by hand. She was not wise in them, and she did not give advice because she had learned in a basement that advice is what people give when they don't want to sit with you. She wrote the same thing to almost all of them in different words. "You're not crazy. You never were. You've just been the only room it could live in." At some point, a journalist found her. It took 4 years. Her name was Adele, and she was 29, and she had been trying for 8 months, and she finally just came to the studio and stood in the doorway. "Mrs. Whitmore, Bennett. Ms. Bennett, I'd like to ask you about the house." Claire didn't look up from the bench. "You can come in," she said, "but I'm working and I don't stop for anything, so you'll have to talk to my back." Adele came in. She asked good questions. That was the surprise. She'd done her homework, and she had a copy of the deposition, and about 40 minutes in, she said, "Can I ask you the one everybody wants?" "Ask." "Do you regret it, covering the mansion with those photographs?" And Claire Bennett kept working for about 4 seconds. Then she put the scalpel down and turned around. "No," she said. "Why? Because I didn't cover anything." Claire pulled her gloves off. "Everybody says it that way. They say she covered the house. That's not what happened. There was already a house full of that. It was in the drawers and the accounts and the guest house and a legal pad and a desk. I didn't bring one thing into that building that wasn't already living in it." Adele was writing fast. "So what did you do?" "I stopped cleaning." Adele looked up. "For 10 years I was the maintenance," Claire said. "That's the whole job, and nobody tells you that's the job when you take it. Every time a fact came loose, I put it back. Every time somebody almost saw something, I laughed and I refilled the water pitcher. I wasn't a wife. I was a full-time employee of a story. And the walls? The walls were my 2 weeks' notice." Adele stopped writing. "Can I use that?" "You'll use it either way," Claire said, and picked the scalpel back up. At the door, Adele turned around. "One more. Please, off the record. There's no such thing. Did you want him destroyed?" And Claire, with her back turned, said the truest thing she had ever said to a stranger. "No," she said. "I wanted a witness. A witness. For 10 years, I was the only person alive who knew what was happening in that house. Do you understand what that does to a mind? He'd lie, and I'd know, and there'd be nobody. Just me and the fact alone together in a room, and then he'd say, 'Sweetheart, you're overthinking,' and I'd start to wonder." Claire's hands didn't stop moving. "I didn't want revenge. Revenge is when you want him to suffer. I wanted 14 people in a hallway. I wanted somebody else in the world to be standing next to the truth at the same time I was," Adele said quietly. "And you got that." "I got that," Claire agreed, "in about 11 minutes. The article ran in September. It was very good. It was also, Claire thought about a woman she didn't quite recognize, and that was fine, and she never read it twice. Things happened to the Whitmores. They happened slowly, the way real things do. Alexander was never charged. That surprised people. It stopped surprising them when they learned that Charles Whitmore had made it his last act of business at 74 to make sure his son signed away every share he held in the company in exchange for a family that did not push. The board took the shares. Ray Whitmore ran it for 6 years and ran it well. Alexander sold real estate in Wellesley. That was the whole ending for him. Not prison, not ruin. He sold houses to people who had never heard of him in a town where his name meant nothing after about 4 years, and he was good at it. Because of course he was good at it, because he had a heart that worked perfectly for 90 seconds at a time. And that is exactly how long it takes to walk someone through a kitchen. He never remarried. Sophia had the baby in October, a girl. She named her Elizabeth after her own grandmother, and she did not use Whitmore, and Margaret Whitmore never once met her. That was Sophia's doing. She moved back to Chicago when the girl was 2. Alexander flew out 1 weekend a month for 11 years and never missed one, and that in the end was the only promise Alexander Whitmore ever kept in his life, and he kept it completely. Sophia wrote to Claire once. It was 8 lines. It arrived in the studio in the 5th year, and Claire read it standing up. I'm not asking you to write back. I know what I am. I want to tell you one thing because nobody else will ever be able to hear it. My daughter is 4. Last week she lied to me about a cup she broke, and she did it well, and my whole body went cold, and I sat on the floor of my kitchen, and I thought about you in a water pitcher. I understand now. It took me 5 years and a 4-year-old to understand what you understood standing in your own kitchen. I'm sorry. That's all this is. Claire read it twice. Then she put it in a drawer, and she did not answer it, and that was the only letter in 11 years she left unanswered, and she never once felt guilty about it. Margaret Whitmore lived to be 81. Charles died first at 79, and he died in that house, and she was there, and by every account she took care of him beautifully for the last 2 years, better than anyone had ever taken care of anyone. That was the thing about Margaret. She was never lying about that part. At the funeral, 4 people came. 4. A woman who had run 4 charities and filled that church twice a year for 30 years, buried her husband in front of 4 people, and one of them was Ray, and one of them was a lawyer, and Nancy Ashford was not there. Margaret sat in the front pew alone. Fenwick told Claire about it in an email. 4 sentences the way he always wrote. He'd retired by then. He'd started a small security company with his son, and it did well, and Claire had loaned him the money to start it, and he had paid back every dollar and had never once said thank you in a way that felt like debt. His last line was, "I'm not telling you to make you happy, ma'am. I'm telling you because you're the only one who'd know what it cost her." Claire read it and closed the laptop and sat for a while, and what she felt in the end was not triumph. It was recognition. Because Margaret Whitmore had spent 68 years being the only adult in the room doing the arithmetic in the next room so that everyone else could be kind. And she had called it kindness right up to the end, and she had died alone in a house on a hill because she had built a life in which nobody was ever required to see her either. They were the same, Claire thought. That was the thing nobody wanted to hear. Margaret and Claire had done the exact same job for the exact same family for a combined 70 years. Only one of them ever put down the pitcher. 11 years after Paris, Claire Bennett went back to Vermont for good. She sold the studio to the 2 women who'd been running it for 6 years anyway, and she sold it cheap, and she never told them how cheap. She rebuilt the house. It took 2 years, and it cost 4 times what the land was worth, and she used the $11 million to do it, which was, Victoria Hayes said on the phone, laughing for the first time in 22 years of friendship, the single most magnificently stupid financial decision I've ever heard of, and I've been doing this since Reagan. It's my money. It's your money, Victoria agreed. Claire. Yeah. You finally spent it. Silence on the line. You're 12, Victoria said. It usually takes them 2. You held out for 12. I wasn't ready. No, Victoria said. You weren't sure it was yours. Claire opened a workshop in the barn. She took 2 students a year from anywhere free, and the only rule was that they had to be over 40 and had to have given something up. That was the actual application. One question: what did you stop doing and who did you stop doing it for? She got 400 applications the first year. The first student was a woman named Dorothy, who was 63 and had not painted since 1987 and cried in the barn on the 3rd day and apologized for 11 minutes. And Claire said, "Dorothy, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Dorothy, look at me." Claire took her hands the way Elise had taken hers in a basement in Paris a lifetime ago. "You're going to do it badly for a while." "I know." "No, you don't know. You think that's a warning. It isn't. It's the good part." Claire held on. "You get to be bad at something. Do you understand what a luxury that is? Nobody's watching. Nobody's disappointed. There's no dinner at 7. Your hands are going to be terrible tomorrow and slightly less terrible the day after, and that is the entire profession. There is no other part." Dorothy stared at her. "Who told you that?" "A woman in Paris," Claire said. 20 years ago, on the worst week of my life." Alexander sent one last message. It came in the 14th year on a Tuesday, and Claire was 62 years old, and she was standing in a barn in Vermont with a cup of coffee. It said, "I heard you rebuilt the house. I'm glad. I mowed a path once. I don't know why I'm telling you. I think I wanted one thing in my life to be true." Claire looked at it for a long time. And then for the first and only time in 14 years, she wrote back. She typed 4 words. "I know, I saw." Then she put the phone in her pocket and went back to work, and she never heard from him again. And when he died at 68, her name was not in the obituary and she did not go. And his daughter Elizabeth, who was 27 by then, and worked in Chicago, and had her mother's chin, wrote Claire a letter that Claire answered the same week by hand, 4 pages, and they wrote to each other twice a year for the rest of Claire's life. That was the ending nobody would have guessed. Not the courtroom, not the collapse. A woman in Vermont and a girl in Chicago writing letters twice a year for 30 years. Because Elizabeth had asked her one question in that first letter, and it was the only question in the whole story that had ever actually mattered. She'd written, "Was my father ever a good man?" And Claire Bennett, 63 years old, sat down at a table her great-grandfather built and thought about a kid with holes in his sneakers outside a coffee shop on Newberry Street in 2007. And she wrote back the truth. Yes. For about 90 seconds at a time for 18 years, and every one of those 90 seconds was real. That's what made him dangerous, and that's what makes you his daughter, and not his fault. He wasn't a liar who learned to feel things. He was a man who felt everything, and never once let it cost him anything. Don't be afraid of his heart, Elizabeth. Be careful with his arithmetic. People asked her sometimes near the end if she'd won. She hated the question. She was 79, and she was still working 4 days a week, and her hands were finally genuinely bad. The tremor she'd been ignoring since a basement in Paris, and she'd started teaching more than cutting, and a young man from a magazine came out to the barn in October and asked her that exact question. "Did you win?" And Claire Bennett put down her coffee. "Son," she said, "there was nothing to win. That's what everybody gets wrong, and they've been getting it wrong for 40 years. But he lost everything. He lost the company. That's arithmetic, and it wasn't mine, and I didn't do it. 22 people in an accounting department did that, and one woman named Karen who'd been carrying a number around in her purse for 2 years. Claire looked out at the trees. "I didn't take anything from that man. I want that on the record because it's the only part I care about. I never took one thing from him." Then what was the point of the photographs? And Claire smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd given a journalist in 40 years. "I'm a restorer," she said. "Do you know what that means? You fix things." "No." She shook her head. "That's the whole misunderstanding right there, and it's the same misunderstanding people have about that house. A restorer doesn't add, ever. That's the first thing they teach you, and it takes 20 years to believe it. If you add, you've made a forgery, and a forgery is just a lie with good technique. Then what do? I take away what's covering the face." The young man stopped writing. "That's it," Claire said. "That's the whole job. There's a woman under 200 years of yellow varnish, and everybody says she's gone. She's ruined, leave her. And she isn't gone. She's been there the entire time. Nobody's just been willing to spend 9 months on their knees taking the dirt off. And the house was a face. Claire said. That's all. I spent one day taking the varnish off it. She picked her coffee back up. And underneath there was a boy with holes in his sneakers and everything he became, and it had been there the whole time, and I was the only one who'd ever had to look at it. Her voice didn't shake, so I stopped looking at it alone. That's the entire story. That's all I ever did. She died at 91 in the house in the spring. Dorothy was there. 2 of her students were there. Elizabeth Carter flew in from Chicago and made it with 4 hours to spare and held her hand, and Claire, who had not been lucid in 2 days, opened her eyes once and said very clearly, "Tell your father I saw the path." And then she was gone. They found the will in a drawer with a photograph in it. Not the wedding, not the mansion, not Paris. A 4x6 print faded of a kid with a bad haircut standing outside a coffee shop on Newberry Street in 2007 with his arm around a girl in a green sweater, and both of them laughing at something nobody would ever know. On the back in her handwriting one line, "She kept this because it happened. The land went to the workshop. 400 women have come through that barn. They still do. There's a rule on the wall in the front room in a frame in Claire Bennett's handwriting, and it's the only thing hanging in the whole building. You are not crazy. You never were. You have just been the only room it could live in." Claire Bennett was not the woman who was betrayed. She was not the woman who got revenge, and she was not the woman who forgave, and she was never once in 91 years the woman anybody thought she was. She was the woman who stopped cleaning up after a lie and stood still and let the whole world look at it with her. And that is why the house fell. Not because she burned it down, because she opened the door, turned on every light, and finally, after 10 years, refused to be the only one who could see.